Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we wake beneath a ceiling of earth while snow keeps falling somewhere above you, pressing the prairie flat and quiet like a heavy hand laid gently over the land. The sound of the storm never quite reaches you. It arrives softened, filtered, almost thoughtful. You probably won't survive this if you expect frontier life to feel brave or cinematic. It is slower than that. It is colder in subtler ways, and it asks for patience long before it rewards effort. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, let me know where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights and let your body grow heavy as the story keeps moving forward without stopping. You lie still for a moment listening. Snow has a way of changing how the world sounds, even when you are buried beneath it. The usual prairie wind that once scraped across grass and ribs the air with noise now feels absent. Not gone, just muted. Above you, layers of soot and packed dirt hold that sound like a thick blanket. What reaches you instead is a kind of hush, broken only by the faint crackle of cooling embers and your own breath settling into rhythm. This is what life is actually like when winter locks the prairie in place and you're living inside a dugout. Not a cave in the dramatic sense, not a bunker, just a practical hollow carved into the land roofed with timber and sod, meant to keep the worst of the season at bay. Many settlers across the Great Plains relied on these earth shelters during the late 19th century, especially in treeless regions where lumber was scarce. That part is not romantic, it is simply true. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb too much. Space is limited here and every movement has a consequence. The ceiling feels close enough to listen to. You can smell it too. Damp soil carries a scent that never fully leaves a mix of clay roots and something faintly metallic. At first people wrote that the smell was unpleasant. Over time they stopped mentioning it altogether. That omission tells its own story. Snow continues to fall above you, piling higher, smoothing the prairie into something almost abstract. You cannot see it, but you can feel its presence. Snow changes temperature patterns. A deep enough layer actually insulates trapping ground warmth instead of letting it escape. That quiet fact mattered a great deal to families like yours. What seems threatening from the outside often works in your favour once you're buried beneath it. You reach out and brush your fingers along the wall. The earth is cool but not frozen. It holds a steady temperature, unlike the air above ground that swings wildly between brutal cold and brief relief. Some modern engineers would later confirm what settlers already understood by feel alone. Soil acts as a thermal buffer. You did not need formulas to know this. You only needed to survive a few winters. The dugout breathes slowly. Moisture seeps in and out. Nothing here is perfectly dry and nothing is entirely wet. That balance defines your comfort more than the cold itself. Blankets are thick. Clothing is layered. Everything you own smells faintly of smoke and earth, because there is nowhere else for those scents to go. Cooking, sleeping, living and waiting all happen in the same shared air. You probably imagined frontier mornings as sharp and dramatic, full of frostbitten heroism. Instead, morning arrives quietly. Light does not burst in, it seeps. The doorway remains closed for now, sealed by snow that has drifted overnight. You do not rush to open it. There is no need. The dugout is warm enough and conserving that warmth is part of the routine. Some accounts mention that families would wait until mid-morning to dig out, letting daylight strengthen before facing the cold. Others describe children pressing their ears to the walls, listening for signs of wind. Historians still argue whether dugout living was primarily a temporary solution or a deliberate long-term adaptation. But either way, winter made the decision for you. You stay where survival feels most reliable. A quirky detail turns up again and again in personal letters. People kept houseplants underground, not because it was practical, but because greenery mattered psychologically. A small pot of hardy ivy or onion greens by the doorway reminded you that life continued somewhere beyond the snow. It is an oddly modern instinct. The stove gives a soft tick as metal contracts. You fed it carefully last night. Not too much. Fires are managed, not indulged. Too much heat dries the air and cracks the walls. Too little invites chill that creeps into bones. Finding that middle ground becomes second nature. You listen again. Silence presses closer than darkness. Snow absorbs sound so thoroughly that the world above feels erased. That can be comforting. It can also be unsettling. There are moments when the lack of noise makes you wonder if anything still exists beyond these walls. You remind yourself that it does. The prairie has not vanished. It is only resting. Your breath fogs faintly in the air, then disappears. You pull a blanket tighter, not because you're cold, but because the weight feels grounding. Life underground narrows focus. You stop thinking in terms of weeks or months. You think in terms of today, of this fire, of whether the roof holds steady after the next storm. There is no dramatic fear here, no constant panic. Fear arrives quietly as a question you never fully answer. What if the snow piles too high? What if the door freezes shut? What if the stove fails? You acknowledge these thoughts and then set them aside because worry without action wastes warmth. Above you, snow keeps falling. You imagine it settling gently, layer by layer, reshaping the prairie into a smooth white lid. Down here, time slows. Your world contracts to the steady pulse of heat breath and patience, and without announcing itself, this becomes normal. You do not wake up warmer exactly, Gail. What you wake up to is steadiness. The kind of quiet, reliable warmth that does not announce itself, but proves its value over long hours. Earth walls do not glow or radiate like a fire. They hold. They keep yesterday's heat from leaving too quickly, and that restraint matters more than intensity ever could. You sit up slowly, careful of the low ceiling. Your head has learned the exact limits of this space. That knowledge lives in your body now, not your thoughts. Packed soil surrounds you on three sides, layered thick enough to feel solid, permanent, almost thoughtful. The prairie loaned you this shelter, and in winter it expects you to listen to how it works. One mainstream historical detail often surprises people. Dugouts were not always signs of desperation. In many parts of the Great Plains during the homestead era, they were considered practical first homes. Timber was scarce, sod was abundant, and earth houses could be built quickly before winter closed in. Some families lived in them for years, not all weeks. Comfort was relative, but survival was measurable. You run your hand along the wall again. The surface is uneven, shaped by shovel, and patience rather than symmetry. In places you can feel bits of root pressed into the clay, reminders that this space was once something else entirely. The wall feels cool but not cold. That difference is everything. Cold air steals heat aggressively. Earth does not. It takes warmth slowly, almost reluctantly. This borrowed warmth changes how you think about winter. Outside, cold feels sharp and active. Inside the dugout, cold becomes passive, something that waits rather than attacks. The earth dulls its edge. That alone makes sleep possible. A faint drip sounds somewhere near the corner, slow and irregular. Meltwater from the roof finds its way down as temperatures shift. You make a mental note. Later you will pack more clay into that seam, press it firm, smooth it with your palm. Small maintenance tasks like this never end, but they keep larger problems away. People who lived in dugouts became excellent observers of moisture. Too much meant rot, too little meant cracking. You shift closer to the stove not because you need more heat, but because habit draws you there. Heat gathers in predictable places. You have learned to arrange daily life around those invisible currents. Sleeping positions, storage spots, even where you sit to eat all follow warmth. There is a curious psychological effect to living surrounded by earth. Modern visitors often describe feeling claustrophobic within minutes. Settlers reported the opposite over time. The walls did not press in, they reassured. Being held by the land reduced exposure, reduced variables. Fewer surprises meant calmer minds. Some scholars continue to debate whether this sense of comfort came from physical insulation alone or from a deeper instinct tied to shelter and enclosure. The argument remains unresolved, but personal accounts lean heavily toward emotional relief. Dugouts felt safe even when they were imperfect. You light the lamp careful with the wick. Flame brightens the space just enough to soften edges without challenging the darkness. Light here is measured intentional. Too much makes the walls feel closer. Too little lets thoughts wander too freely. Balance again becomes the theme of the season. The ceiling creaks faintly as the structure adjusts. Timber beams above you carry the weight of sod and snow. You trust them not blindly but through repetition. They held yesterday. They held last week. They will likely hold today. Trust in winter is built this way through small confirmations. A quirky habit noted in some dugout homes involved hanging blankets or quilts along the walls, not for decoration but for added insulation. Fabric trapped air, softened moisture, and made the space feel less raw. Over time, these layers turned bare earth into something resembling a room. You wrap yourself in one of those blankets now. Wool scratches slightly, but you welcome the sensation. It reminds you that you are awake present, still capable of adjusting. Life underground sharpens awareness of small things, the way fabric warms, the way breath slows, the way silence settles. Snow continues its work above you, pressing down gently. As odd as it sounds, heavy snow often improved conditions inside a dugout. It sealed draft, stabilized temperature, and reduced the need for constant fire feeding. Settlers learned to appreciate deep drifts even as they limited movement. You think about the prairie beyond your walls, flat, vast, hostile in winter. Up here, wind scours flesh. Down here, earth absorbs it. That contrast defines your days. You do not conquer the environment. You tuck yourself into it and wait. There is no heroic posture in this, just cooperation. You borrow warmth from yesterday's shelter, from soil time, from patience. And slowly, almost without noticing, winter becomes something you manage rather than something that happens to you. You lean back, letting the wall support your weight. The earth does not shift, it holds steady. In that steadiness you find enough comfort to begin the day. Morning does not announce itself with light spilling across a horizon. There is no horizon here. You learn to recognize the start of the day through subtler signals. The air feels slightly different. The stove has cooled enough to demand attention. Your body wakes before your eyes, fully guided by routine rather than sunrise. You sit quietly for a moment, listening again. The prairie above you remains sealed under snow, but sound still finds its way down in altered forms. Wind does not howl. It hums distant and flattened like breath through thick cloth. That muted quality tells you the storm has passed and a cold has settled in behind it. This matters. Clear, bitter cold behaves differently than falling snow. One widely accepted historical reality is that many dugouts had no windows at all, especially in their earliest form. Light entered only when the door opened or through a small stovepipe gap. Some families later added window openings at ground level, but during heavy snow years those were often buried completely. Living without a view was not a philosophical choice, it was simply how the structure worked. You rise carefully, mindful of the ceiling. Your hand brushes the beam overhead out of habit. You check it instinctively as if wood might change overnight. It never does, but reassurance is part of survival. Without a window, weather becomes something you interpret rather than observe. Frost on the doorframe tells you about overnight temperatures. The way smoke lingers when you open the stove hints at air pressure outside. Even your ears adjust. Snow absorbs sound so thoroughly that silence becomes a clue. Too much of it can mean heavy drifts or a sky cleared hard and cold. You reach for your boots, stiff from yesterday's dampness. They never fully dry in winter. You warm them near the stove before pulling them on. Leather softens slowly. Everything down here moves at a measured pace. A curious detail appears in several settler journals. People often describe time feeling thicker underground, as if hours stretched. Without visual cues like sunrise or passing shadows, the day becomes a sequence of tasks rather than a timeline. You do not count minutes, you count actions. Feed the fire, prepare food, check the door, rest, repeat. Some historians continue to debate whether this altered sense of time contributed to seasonal melancholy or helped protect mental health by simplifying daily expectations. The evidence points both ways. For some, the routine was calming. For others, it was quietly oppressive. You light the lamp, again adjusting it until the flame steadies. Light pools in a small circle, leaving corners in soft shadow. You have learned not to chase darkness away entirely. It feels better when it stays contained. You kneel near the door and run your fingers along the packed earth at its base. It feels solid, cold, but not frozen. Snow has sealed the outside, pressing tightly against the entrance. You will need to dig out later, but not yet. There is warmth to hold on to first. Food preparation begins without ceremony. A pot goes on the stove, water warms slowly. Smell gathers quickly in this confined space. Coffee substitute porridge, something simple. Cooking underground means accepting that scents linger long after meals end. Smoke clings to hair and clothing, earth absorbs the rest. There is something oddly intimate about eating without daylight. You rely on taste and warmth more than sight. The bowl warms your hands. Steam fogs the air briefly before disappearing into the walls. You eat slowly, listening to the quiet. Above you, animals move. You cannot see them, but you imagine them. Livestock shifting weight, hooves crunching snow, wild creatures passing silently overhead, unaware of the human life just beneath their feet. This layered existence is easy to forget until you remember how thin the separation really is. A quirky note from one Frontier account mentions that people sometimes knock gently on the ceiling during heavy snowfall, not to signal anyone, but to reassure themselves that the roof still felt solid. You smile faintly at the thought. You do not knock. You trust weight and repetition instead. As the morning settles, you feel the tug to open the door to rejoin the outside world, if only briefly. You gather tools and brace yourself. Digging out is work, but it is also connection. Proof that the prairie still exists beyond these walls. Before you do, you pause. You breathe in the earthy air, steady and familiar. The dugout has done its job through another night. It has held warmth, quieted the storm, narrowed the world to something manageable. You place your hand on the door and feel the resistance on the other side. Snow waits there patient and heavy. Morning may lack a horizon, but it still moves forward, and so do you. The floor gives slightly beneath your weight, not enough to alarm you, just enough to remind you that this shelter rests directly against the earth itself. You notice it most in winter when moisture behaves differently. Cold locks water in place, then releases it slowly. The ground beneath you never feels completely dry, but it also never floods. It holds dampness the way it holds heat patiently, without drama. You squat and press your fingers into the soil near the wall. It yields, then firms again. This simple test tells you more than any instrument could. The earth is holding water, not rejecting it. That means no sudden seepage today. You smooth the surface again with the side of your hand, restoring it to the careful flatness you prefer. Many prairie dugouts were built with dirt floors rather than wood. Lumber was precious, and boards trapped moisture if they were not carefully elevated. Period records from homesteading regions note that families often postponed installing wooden floors until they were confident the dugout would last. Some never added them at all. Bare earth was easier to manage, easier to repair, and oddly forgiving. Dampness shapes your routine more than cold ever does. Wet bedding draws heat away from the body faster than frigid air. You learnt that early, possibly the hard way. Now you rotate blankets, carefully moving them closer to the stove during the day, hanging them when possible, accepting that nothing will ever feel fully crisp again until spring. You lift a corner of a mat and check beneath it. The soil there feels slightly cooler but still firm. No pooling. Good. Small checks like this happen without conscious thought now. You do not call them chores, they're simply part of staying comfortable enough. There is a faint smell rising from the floor, richer than the wall scent. It reminds you of turned fields in warmer months of planting season long past. At first, newcomers complained about it. Letters mention the odour of earth clinging to everything. Later entries rarely bring it up. Familiarity dulls offence. Some researchers suggest that this acceptance happened faster than expected because the smell signalled safety. Earth meant insulation. Earth meant stability. The mind learned to associate that scent with warmth and survival. There is still discussion among historians about how much sensory adaptation shaped emotional resilience in winter shelters, but the pattern appears repeatedly. You shift a crate slightly, adjusting its legs to keep it off the coldest patch of ground. Storage here is strategic. Food, tools and clothing all have preferred places determined by airflow and temperature rather than convenience. Root vegetables do well closer to the floor. Dry goods stay elevated. You learn this by observation, not instruction. A lesser-known habit surfaces in some winter diaries. People sprinkled ash or sand on damp patches of floor to reduce slickness and absorb moisture. It was not elegant, but it worked. You keep a small bucket of ash nearby for that purpose. It also discourages insects when temperatures rise again. The stove warms slowly. Heat spreads outward, then settles low before rising. You feel it first in your feet, then your hands. The floor responds gradually. It never becomes warm in the way wood does, but it loses its edge. That is enough. You sit down to mend a sock, working carefully in the limited light. Needlework underground demands patience. Shadows blur fine detail. You hold the fabric close, feeling more than seeing. Small repairs matter here. Replacements are rare in winter. Your thoughts drift as your hands work. You think about how the prairie looks right now, buried and sunk. You imagine the snow sealing cracks above you, reinforcing the dugout like an extra layer of insulation. Snow presses the earth tighter, making the floor beneath you feel more contained, more secure. There is a quiet irony here. Moisture feels like a threat, but it is also part of what keeps the dugout stable. Completely dry soil would crack. Completely wet soil would slump. The balance between those extremes defines whether the walls hold. You learn to live within that narrow comfort zone. You pause and listen again. Nothing drips, nothing shifts. The stove hums faintly. That absence of trouble is a kind of success. Winter teaches you to appreciate when nothing happens. Some settlement accounts mention children drawing shapes in the dirt floor during long storms, tracing patterns that disappeared within hours. The ground became both surface and eraser. You smile at the thought, imagining small hands pressing lines that would not asked but still mattered. You brush dirt from your palms and flex your fingers. The floor will always demand attention, but it never asks for perfection. That is part of its strange kindness. You can smooth it again tomorrow. You can patch it again next week. It forgives mistakes as long as you keep showing up. As the day continues, the floor remains quietly present beneath everything you do. It does not support furniture alone. It supports your rhythm, your sense of steadiness. Above you, snow continues to reshape the prairie. Below you, the earth holds damp but dependable, asking only that you notice when it changes. The stove sits at the centre of your attention long before it sits at the centre of the room. Everything you do bends around it. Where you stand, where you sleep, where you set things down to dry, even though dry is an optimistic word in winter. This small metal box decides how comfortable the next hours will be, and it does so without caring how tired you feel. You crouch and open the door slowly. A soft breath of ash rises warm and dusty. The embers from last night glow faintly, still alive, still useful. You add fuel carefully, one piece at a time. Too much wood at once wastes heat and risks overheating the space. Too little means you will be feeding it again sooner than you would like. Fire management becomes instinct learned through long nights and small mistakes. One well-established historical reality is that frontier stoves were often smaller than people imagine. In dugouts, especially overwood stoves, were dangerous. Excess heat dried the air too quickly, cracked walls and increased the risk of chimney fires. Settlers favoured modest stoves that burned steadily rather than fiercely. Survival favoured consistency over intensity. You close the door and wait. Metal ticks softly as it warms. Sound behaves differently around fire. The stove gives off small, deliberate noises that you come to recognise. A certain click means expansion. A certain hiss means damp fuel. These sounds reassure you. Silence from the stove would worry you more. As warmth spreads, you feel the room respond. Air begins to move in gentle loops. Heat settles low first, then creeps upward. You position yourself accordingly, letting your feet soak it in. This is not comfort in the modern sense, it is functional warmth. Enough to keep blood moving, enough to keep fingers flexible. Smoke is the constant negotiation. The chimney must draw properly, or the room fills with it. You watch the flame reading its behaviour. A lazy flame suggests poor airflow. A sharp one tells you the draft is strong. You adjust vents and fuel until the fire behaves the way you want it to. Period observations from prairie settlements often mention how quickly people learn to read fire. Children learned it too. Knowing how to tend a stove was not a specialised skill. It was basic literacy in winter living. You glance toward the stovepipe where it disappears into the ceiling. That junction demands attention. Soot builds there. Moisture collects. You clean it regularly, scraping gently, wiping residue away. Neglect turns small problems into emergencies. A lesser-known practice shows up in some dugout households. People placed a shallow pan of water near the stove to counteract overly dry air. While moisture was usually abundant underground, intense heat could reverse that balance. Cracked lips and sore throats followed. The pan helped regulate humidity, another quiet adjustment in a long list of them. As the stove settles into a steady burn, you take advantage of it. You move damp items closer, rotating them slowly so nothing scorches. Gloves first, then socks, then heavier garments. Nothing dries fast, but everything improves a little. Improvement is enough. You set a kettle on top and listen as it begins to warm. The sound of water heating becomes part of the background, a soft promise that you will soon have something hot to drink. Warm liquids matter more than people realise. They heat you from the inside reach, places blankets cannot. There is a particular smell that only appears when a stove has been burning for hours in a confined space, a mix of metal ash and faintly sweet smoke. At first it irritates the nose, later it fades into normalcy. Some settlers wrote that they missed that smell when they finally moved above ground. It had come to mean shelter. Scholars remain divided on whether dugout living increased respiratory illness because of smoke exposure or reduced it by limiting drafts and extreme cold. Accounts vary. What is clear is that people learned to manage smoke aggressively. Doors were cracked briefly. Chimneys were cleared often. Fire was controlled, not indulged. You eat near the stove, savouring the warmth. Crumbs fall to the dirt floor, quickly lost among grains of soil. Cleanliness here follows different rules. You sweep regularly, but perfection is unnecessary. Dirt is already part of the environment. You focus instead on keeping things dry enough, warm enough, safe enough. The stove demands attention throughout the day. It is not something you light and forget. It is a companion that requires conversation. You respond to its needs and it responds to yours. That relationship shapes the rhythm of winter days. You think briefly about how fire looks above ground right now, smoke rising sharply into cold air visible for miles. Down here it disappears quietly, leaving only warmth behind. That invisibility feels appropriate. Dugout life is about minimizing exposure, about letting the prairie forget you for a while. As afternoon approaches, the stove burns steadily. You allow yourself a moment of rest, leaning back against the wall. The heat wraps around you just enough to ease muscles without making you drowsy. That balance again. Always balance. Outside snow reflects sunlight harshly. Inside light stays soft. Firelight flickers against earth walls, smoothing their roughness. You watch shadows move slowly, unhurried. There is no rush here. Winter has removed urgency from most things. A note from a homestead letter describes the stove as the heart of the dugout. Not because it was loved, but because without it nothing else functioned. That blunt assessment feels accurate. The stove is not romantic, it is essential. You add another piece of fuel and close the door. The fire responds immediately, brightening, settling. You nod, slightly satisfied. The room remains warm enough. The walls hold, the snow stays outside. For now the balance holds, and in winter that is more than enough. You become aware of the air before you think about it. A slight heaviness in your chest. A warmth that feels thick rather than sharp. Breathing underground teaches you to notice these things early. Air here is not infinite. It must be encouraged to move refreshed gently, without inviting the cold to rush in unannounced. You sit quietly and take a slow breath through your nose. The air smells faintly of smoke and earth, familiar enough to feel safe. That familiarity did not come easily at first. Early accounts from new settlers often mention headaches and dizziness during their first winters underground. The adjustment was real. The body learned or it protested. One well-documented practice among dugout dwellers was deliberate ventilation even during the coldest days. A small opening near the roof or a briefly opened door allowed stale air to escape. This was done sparingly, timed carefully, and closed again as soon as fresh air had circulated. People learn to exchange air without losing heat. You rise and move toward the doorway, placing your hand against the wood. Frost rims the edges thick and white. You do not open it yet. Instead, you adjust the stovepipe damper, encouraging a stronger draw. The fire responds, pulling air upward and out. This movement matters. It keeps smoke from lingering and refreshes the space without a rush of cold. Air behaves differently underground. It settles, it pools. Without attention, it becomes stale. You learnt that the hard way one evening, when the room felt oppressive and sleep came poorly. Now you manage airflow the way you manage fire. Slowly, deliberately. A curious detail found in some prairie households involved hanging small cloth strips near ventilation points. Their movement, or lack of it, told residents where the air was circulating. This low-tech method worked well in a space where even a small draft mattered. You glance toward your own strip and see it shift slightly. Enough. You sit again, feeling the change almost immediately. The room feels lighter, less dense. Breathing becomes easier. This is not dramatic, it is subtle, but winter survival often is. There has long been discussion among scholars about whether dugouts were healthier than above-ground cabins during winter. Some evidence suggests that reduced exposure to extreme cold and wind lowered rates of frost-related illness. Others argue that limited ventilation increased respiratory problems. The truth appears mixed, shaped heavily by how well a household managed airflow. You pay attention because attention is what keeps small issues from growing. A cough in winter lingers longer. Fatigue deepens faster. You listen to your own breathing as carefully as you listen to the stove. You pour yourself a cup of warm liquid and sip slowly. Steam rises briefly, then disappears. Moisture returns to the air, countering the stove's drying effect. Again, balance. Everything here is a negotiation between extremes. Outside, the prairie air is brutally clean and sharp. Inside air becomes something you curate. That difference changes how you think about the environment. Above ground, you endure it. Below ground, you manage it. There is a particular sound that tells you when ventilation has gone wrong. A faint ringing in your ears, a pressure behind the eyes. You have felt it before and corrected it quickly. You never let it go long. Experience sharpens these instincts. Some personal journals mention people feeling drowsy more often underground, attributing it to darkness or cold. Others suspected air quality. Modern interpretations vary, but the accounts agree on one thing: people learned to intervene early. Waiting made problems worse. You check the stovepipe again, ensuring nothing obstructs it. Soot build-up narrows airflow. You clean it regularly, scraping carefully, catching residue in a small container. This task is dull but necessary. The air depends on it. As midday approaches, you crack the door open just enough to exchange air. Cold rushes in briefly, sharp and clean. You brace yourself, then close it again. The temperature drops slightly, then stabilizes. The room feels refreshed, alert. You exhale slowly and feel the space respond. Air circulates, heat settles, smoke clears. This cycle repeats throughout the day, barely noticeable once it becomes habit. There is a strange intimacy in managing air. It is invisible yet essential. You cannot store it, you cannot ignore it. You work with it moment by moment. Underground life teaches you this with patience rather than force. Snow still seals the prairie above. The outside world remains distant and bright, unforgiving. Down here you craft a pocket of livable air within earth and seed sod. It is not perfect. It does not need to be. It only needs to be good enough. You sit back and listen again. The stove hums. The cloth strip moves gently. Your breathing steadies. The dugout continues to function as intended, not as a hiding place, but as a system. A quiet one adjusted by hand and attention. Winter continues, but so do you. Light becomes something you measure rather than something you enjoy. It arrives in small amounts and leaves just as quietly. When you first moved underground, the absence of windows felt like a loss. Now it feels like a system. You decide when light enters your day, and that control changes how time behaves. You adjust the lamp wick carefully. Too high and it smokes. Too low and shadows take over. The flame steadies, casting a soft glow that barely reaches the corners of the dugout. You have learned that brightness is not the goal. Visibility is. Enough to see your hands. Enough to read the wall for cracks. Enough to reassure your mind without waking it fully. Many prairie households relied on kerosene lamps or simple oil lights during winter, especially when daylight hours shrank dramatically. Winter records from northern plain settlements mention families rising and sleeping earlier, not out of discipline, but because light was costly. Every extra hour of illumination meant more fuel burned and more smoke to manage. You move the lamp slightly, watching how shadows shift across the earth walls. Light behaves differently here. It does not bounce, it settles, it absorbs into clay and fabric instead of reflecting sharply. This softens everything. Even your thoughts seem to slow when the light is low and warm. You remember how blinding snowlight can be above ground. Sunlight reflecting off white drifts strains the eyes, leaving headaches behind. Down here your eyes rest. Darkness is never total, but it is close enough to feel protective. A small habit surfaces from memory. Some families mark the wall with faint charcoal lines to track days through winter. Each mark represented survival rather than time passed. Not everyone did this, and not everyone found it helpful. You choose not to. You feel days more accurately through routine than counting. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how reduced light affected mood during long winters underground. Some accounts describe irritability and restlessness. Others describe a surprising calm and narrowing of focus that reduced anxiety. Personal letters suggest that people who embraced the rhythm fared better than those who resisted it. You sit and let the lamp burn while you work with your hands. Sewing, repairing, sorting. These tasks suit low light. They do not require speed. They reward patience. You pause often, letting your eyes rest. Darkness becomes a companion rather than a threat. You ration lamp use carefully. During daylight hours, you rely on indirect light filtering through the doorway seams or stovepipe opening. It is faint but enough. When night arrives early, you light the lamp without guilt. Evenings stretch long in winter, and mental comfort matters as much as physical warmth. An overlooked detail appears in several winter household lists. Extra lamp wicks. People stock them deliberately, knowing a broken wick could darken a room completely. Light was fragile. You treat it that way. You notice how the absence of visual distraction sharpens other senses. Sound becomes clearer. Smell more defined. You hear the stove settle, the faint creak of wood adjusting above you. Outside noise barely exists. Snow absorbs everything, leaving only your own movements audible. The dugout feels smaller in low light, but not oppressive. The walls seem closer yet softer. Shadows blur edges, making the space feel less rigid. This suits winter. Sharp lines feel out of place when the world has snowed. You eat by lamplight, savouring warmth more than flavour. Steam rises briefly, catching the glow before fading. The room feels suspended, separate from the frozen prairie above. You imagine the moon shining on snow you cannot see. That distance feels comforting. Some people wrote that living underground changed their relationship with daylight permanently. Even after moving into above-ground houses, they preferred softer light-shaded rooms early evenings. The dugout trained their senses in subtlety. You lower the wick slightly as the evening deepens. Light dims, inviting rest. You wrap yourself in a blanket and sit back against the wall. Your eyes half closed, thoughts slow drifting without urgency. There is no reason to fight the darkness. Winter has already claimed the outside world. Inside you, create a pocket of gentleness. Light does not dominate here. It supports. You extinguish the lamp carefully, leaving a faint ember of glow in the stove. Darkness settles complete but not frightening. Your breathing steadies. The earth around you holds warmth, quiet, and shadow in equal measure. Night feels longer underground but also deeper. You do not rush sleep. You let it arrive when it wants to. In the absence of light, time stretches softly unbroken. Above you, snow reflects starlight you will never see. Below you rest in a darkness shaped by choice, habit, and survival, and without effort, the day slips away. Snow changes its role once it has settled deep enough. At first, it feels like an enemy piling up, blocking the door, erasing paths. After a while, you begin to notice what it gives back. The dugout feels steadier. Drafts soften. The temperature inside stops swinging so sharply. Snow becomes a lid placed carefully over the land, sealing warmth in rather than letting it escape. You press your palm against the wall again and sense the difference. The earth feels more even now, less reactive. When the prairie is bare, cold travels freely through soil. When snow blankets everything above the ground seems to relax. The dugout holds its heat with less effort. The stove does not have to work as hard. You feed it less often and notice the change almost immediately. Settlement journals from heavy snow years describe this effect with quiet appreciation. People wrote that the cold felt gentler after the drifts grew tall, even though temperatures dropped lower. The insulation mattered more than the number on a thermometer, though few settlers owned one anyway. They judged winter by a comfort, not measurement. You step closer to the door and run your fingers along the seam where snow presses from the outside. It feels firm, almost supportive. The drift has moulded itself perfectly to the shape of the entrance. Wind cannot sneak through, the door feels heavier but also more secure. Isolation deepens with every snowfall. Roads vanish, fence lines disappear. The prairie becomes an unbroken field of white. You know neighbours exist somewhere out there, but distance stretches until it feels theoretical. Letters cannot travel easily. Visits stop entirely. Winter simplifies social life by removing it, and yet this isolation does not always feel lonely. Inside the dugout, the world has narrowed to a manageable size. You focus on what is present rather than what is missing. The quiet outside reinforces the quiet within. There is still disagreement among researchers about whether snowbound isolation strengthened family bonds or intensified tension. Some accounts describe closeness, shared routines, and mutual reliance. Others hint at irritation and confinement. Both appear true depending on the people involved and the length of the winter. You listen to the snow in a different way now. Instead of waiting for it to stop, you accept its presence as structural. It shapes your days. You shovel when necessary, but you do not resent the drifts. They have become part of the shelter itself. A small but telling practice shows up in a few winter recollections. People packed snow deliberately against exposed sides of their dugouts, reinforcing insulation where sod was thin. Snow was not just endured, it was used. This practical mindset defined frontier survival more than any sense of bravery. Inside sound remains muted. Even louder movements feel dampened. You drop a tool accidentally and are surprised by how softly it lands. Snow absorbs vibration as well as noise. The prairie feels padded, gentled by winter. You sit down to rest, leaning back against the wall. The dugout feels heavier somehow, not oppressive, but grounded. Snow presses downward. Earth presses inward, and you rest in the middle of those forces. That containment brings a strange comfort. Food lasts longer, so cooler ground temperatures keep stored items from spoiling. Root vegetables remain crisp, preserved meat stays solid. You rearrange stores, occasionally checking for moisture, but winter's cold works in your favour here. There are days when the door remains closed entirely. No need to dig out. No reason to face the glare and cold. You accept these days without guilt. Waiting is not laziness in winter. It is strategy. You notice how your body responds. Muscles loosen when you stop bracing against cold air. Your shoulders drop. Breathing feels easier. The world above may be locked in ice, but down here conditions are stable. Some personal letters mention people feeling safer during heavy snowstorms than during windy, cold spells. Wind found cracks, snow filled them. That simple observation shaped how people felt about winter weather over time. You think about danger differently now. Snow can trap you, yes. Can delay help, yes. But it also protects. It dampens sound, conceals smoke, and smooths the landscape. Predators, human or otherwise, pass overhead without noticing you. The dugout disappears into the prairie once snow covers it fully. From above it is almost invisible. That anonymity offers peace. You are not on display, you are folded into the land. You warm your hands near the stove and feel gratitude rise quietly. Not dramatic gratitude, practical gratitude. The kind that acknowledges function rather than beauty. Snow has become part of the system that keeps you alive. As evening approaches, the temperature outside drops further. Inside, it barely changes. The stove holds steady. The walls remain calm. Snow continues to press down gently, evenly. You lie back and let that pressure exist without resisting it. The prairie sleeps under its white covering. You sleep beneath it, protected by layers of earth, sod, and snow working together. Winter has not disappeared. It has settled, and within that settled world you find room to breathe. Clothing becomes a slow rotation rather than a clean cycle. Nothing you wear ever feels entirely dry, and you stop expecting it to. Wool holds warmth even when damp, which is why it earned your loyalty despite its weight and itch. Leather stiffens in the cold, softens near the stove, then stiffens again. Everything you put on carries yesterday with it. You reach for a shirt and feel the faint chill still trapped in the fabric. Not frozen, just cool, you warm it briefly near the stove, turning it by hand so no single spot scorches. This ritual happens every morning. It does not feel tedious, it feels necessary, like stretching before work. Frontier households relied heavily on wool for winter clothing, not because it was comfortable, but because it worked. Period supply lists and settlement inventories show wool garments outnumbering cotton by a wide margin during cold months. Wool retained heat, resisted sparks, and dried, slowly but reliably in confined spaces like dugouts. You pull on layers in a specific order learned through trial. Thin first, then heavier. Too many layers trap moisture against your skin. Too few let cold creep in. You have felt both mistakes before and adjusted accordingly. Boots are the most difficult. Snow melts on contact, then refreezes. Moisture works its way into seams and stays there. You keep them near the stove, but never close enough to warp the leather. The smell of damp hide is constant, sharp at first, then familiar. Some winter diaries mention people stuffing boots with dry grass or crumpled paper overnight to absorb moisture. Others used heated stones wrapped in cloth, though this carried risks. You stick to safer methods, turning boots often and accepting slow progress. There is still debate among researchers about how effective these drying techniques truly were in prolonged winter conditions. Accounts vary widely. What seems consistent is that people adapted their expectations rather than fighting physics. Dry enough became the goal. You notice how clothing changes your movement underground. Layers restrict motion sun slightly. Sleeves catch. Knees resist bending. You move more deliberately, conserving energy and avoiding unnecessary exertion. Winter teaches efficiency through inconvenience. You mend garments often. A small tear left unattended grows quickly in daily wear. Needle and thread become winter tools. You work by lamplight, feeling seams more than seeing them. Repairs are rarely neat, but they hold. A detail that appears in several family recollections involves sleeping in clothing rather than changing fully at night. The reason was simple. Morning cold punished bare skin. Warming clothes with your body overnight saved fuel and time. Comfort took second place to practicality. You sit back after dressing, flexing fingers, rolling shoulders. The layers settle. They feel heavier than summer clothes, but also reassuring. Weight equals warmth. You welcome it. The dugout smells faintly of fabric and smoke now layered over earth. Clothing absorbs these scents and carries them everywhere. You stop noticing unless something changes. A new smell means a problem. Normal smells mean stability. Outside snow continues to dictate conditions. Inside clothing becomes your first line of defense even before fire or walls. You treated it with remarkable. You hang damp items where warm air moves best, not where it is hottest. Experience taught you that too much heat hardens fibers and traps moisture inside. Slow drying works better. Patience again. Some accounts describe people feeling oddly undressed when spring finally arrived and layers came off. Skin felt exposed. Lightness felt unfamiliar. Winter clothing had become a kind of armor. You finish adjusting your last layer and move toward the day's tasks. The clothes do their job quietly, not making you warm but keeping you from getting colder. That distinction matters. Winter does not reward excess. It rewards enough. Enough layers. Enough dryness. Enough attention. You've learned to live within those limits. As you bend to tend the stove again, fabric shifts and settles. The weight follows you. It does not drag. It supports. In the dugout, clothing is not about appearance or comfort. It is about cooperation between body material and environment. You accept that fully now. And with that acceptance, the day moves forward steady and manageable, one layer at a time. Food feels heavier in winter, not in your stomach, but in your thoughts. Every item stored beneath the prairie carries intention. Nothing here is casual. You do not reach for meals on impulse. You reach for what will last, what will warm you slowly, what will not demand more fuel than it gives back. You kneel near the storage area and lift a cloth covering. Cool air rises from below and faintly sweet root vegetables sit packed together, cushioned by straw and soil. Potatoes, turnips, onions. They rest in darkness that suits them. Under sound, the temperature stays low but stable, preventing rot without freezing them solid. This arrangement was common across prairie settlements where cellars were carved directly into the earth or folded into dugouts themselves. You check each item by touch, more than sight. Firm is good. Soft means trouble. You set aside anything questionable for immediate use. Waste is not dramatic here. It is unacceptable. Preserved meat hangs nearby, wrapped carefully. Salted pork, dried beef. The smell is strong but reassuring. Preservation methods varied widely from household to household, and not all of them worked equally well. Some families relied heavily on smoking, others on salting, others on cold alone. Surviving winter depended less on which method you chose, and more on how consistently you monitored the results. You lift a small sack of dried beans and feel their weight. They rattle faintly. Sound becomes a form of confirmation. Hard means dry, dry means edible. You set them back and reach for a jar instead. Glass is precious. You handle it carefully. Cracks appear easily in cold and replacements are rare. There is a rhythm to winter eating that you did not anticipate before living this way. Meals simplify. Variety gives way to reliability. Hot liquids matter more than spices. Texture matters more than novelty. You find satisfaction in predictability. A detail tucked into several homestead letters mentions people keeping food inventories in their heads rather than on paper. Lists froze, tore, or went missing. Memory became the record. You know exactly how many meals each sack represents. You adjust portions accordingly without thinking. You set a pot on the stove and add water, then something solid. It simmers slowly. Underground cooking favors time over flame. Rapid boiling wastes fuel and scorches food. Slow heat draws flavor out of simple ingredients. You stir occasionally, listening to the sound change as the mixture thickens. Smell fills the dugout quickly. There is no escape from it. Cooking scents linger long after eating ends. You've learned to choose meals whose smells you can live with for hours. Some foods are avoided entirely in winter for this reason. Taste is only part of the decision. Accounts from prairie households often mention monotony in winter diets, but they also note an unexpected comfort in it. Familiar meals required less thought. Less thought conserved energy. Energy mattered. You sit to eat bowl warming your hands before it ever warms your stomach. Steam fogs the air briefly, then disappears. You eat slowly, aware that digestion itself generates warmth. This is not indulgence, it is strategy. There is disagreement among later interpreters about how nutritionally sufficient these winter diets truly were. Some argue deficiencies were common. Others point out that people adjusted quantities and relied on stored fats more than records suggest. What remains clear is that survival rates depended heavily on food management rather than abundance. After eating, you clean carefully. Scraps attract attention you do not want even in winter. Rodents find their way underground despite cold. You seal containers tightly, press lids firm, tuck cloth back into place. Order matters here. You store food low where the earth stays coolest. Shelves closer to the ceiling fluctuate too much. You learned that during an early winter when a thaw spoiled several jars near the roof and experience corrected you, the earth taught you where to trust it. There is an odd intimacy in knowing exactly where each meal comes from. No distance exists between storage and table. You feel the weight of remaining supplies each time you reach for them. That awareness sharpens appreciation without turning into anxiety. Some families reportedly marked particularly precious items and saved them for emotional reasons rather than nutritional ones. A jar of preserved fruit for a birthday, a bit of sugar for the coldest night. These choices were not efficient, but they mattered. You understand that now. You return unused items to their places and smooth the coverings again. The storage area returns to stillness. Food waits patiently unchanged by the passing of hours. Outside, the prairie remains frozen and unreachable. Inside, sustenance rests within arm's reach. This contrast defines winter underground. Scarcity exists, but so does control. You wipe your hands and lean back against the wall. The meal settles. Warmth spreads slowly, steady and real. The dugout smells of earth and cooking layered together. It feels complete. Food beneath the prairie does not promise comfort or pleasure. It promises continuity. Another day fed, another night possible. That promise carries you forward quietly without spectacle. Cooking underground teaches you that smell has nowhere to go, does not drift away on wind or dissolve into open space. It settles into fabric, clay, hair and memory. Every meal leaves a trace, and you learn to plan not just for hunger, but for what you are willing to live with afterward. You lift the lid from the pot and breathe in carefully. Steam rises thick and warm, carrying the full character of what you've made. It fills the dugout, immediately pressing outward until it meets the walls and turns back on itself. This is not unpleasant. It is simply complete. The meal announces itself and stays. You stir slowly, mindful of splatter. Grease on dirt floors is harder to manage than spilled water. It darkens soil, attracts pests, and never truly disappears. You've learned to cook with restraint, keeping movements deliberate and contained. Many winter households chose meals that required long simmering rather than active cooking. Stews, porridges, thick soups. These dishes allowed people to tend other tasks while food prepared itself. The stove stayed warm, fuel burned steadily, and attention could shift elsewhere. This approach appears repeatedly in winter accounts from prairie regions. You move a damp cloth closer to the stove, letting warm air pass over it. Cooking heat doubles as drying heat. Nothing goes unused. Even the warmth from boiling water contributes to comfort. The smell of food mixes with the constant undertone of smoke and earth. It creates a layered atmosphere that becomes familiar enough to fade from awareness. Only when something new enters the space do you notice how saturated the air already is. You ladle food into a bowl and set it aside to cool slightly. Eating too fast brings discomfort later. Underground living teaches patience in all things, even hunger. Some families we reportedly cooked just once a day during the coldest stretches, reheating portions later to avoid repeated smoke and odour build-up. Others preferred smaller, more frequent meals to maintain warmth. The surviving descriptions do not agree fully on which method worked better, suggesting that households adapted based on stove-size fuel supply and personal tolerance. You sit down to eat careful of your posture. Space limits how you move. Knees bend differently, backs curve more. You adjust without thinking now. Your body has learned the geometry of this place. As you eat, the smell deepens. It clings to the walls, then slowly softens as steam fades. You know it will linger for hours. You accept that. Freshness is not a winter expectation. A small but telling habit appears in a few winter recollections. People burned bits of dried herbs or coffee grounds after cooking to soften lingering odours. It did not eliminate them, but it changed their character. You have tried this once or twice more for morale than effect. You wipe the bowl clean and rinse it with minimal water. Moisture control never stops. You dry it immediately and return it to its place. Cleanliness here is not about appearance. It is about preventing future problems. You notice how sound behaves during cooking. The gentle bubble of simmering food feels louder than it should. The scrape of a spoon against a pot echoes softly. Snow above absorbs outside noise so thoroughly that interior sounds feel magnified by comparison. There is still uncertainty among historians about how people tolerated the constant overlap of smells in confined winter dwellings. Some accounts describe nausea and frustration. Others barely mention it at all. The difference may lie in expectation. Those who arrived prepared adjusted more easily. You finish eating and sit quietly for a moment, letting warmth settle. The meal has done its job. Your hands feel looser. Your breath feels deeper. This internal warmth matters more than external heat. You open the door just a crack long enough to exchange air. Cold rushes in briefly, sharp and clean. It collides with cooking smells and smoke, then disappears as you close the door again. The room resets not fully, but enough. You lean back and rest, listening to the stove. Cooking time doubles as rest time here. The boundaries between tasks blur. Everything serves multiple purposes. Some people wrote that they missed winter dugout meals once spring arrived. Not the food itself, but the way eating had been slowed down, the way attention narrowed. Meals became events rather than interruptions. You clean the pot carefully and set it upside down to dry. The smell remains, but it softens into the background. Earth absorbs part of it. Fabric absorbs the rest. By nightfall, it will feel like part of the dugout's permanent character. You stretch slowly and prepare to move on to the next task. Cooking has warmed the space, the air in your body. The dugout feels lived in, active, awake. Above you, snow continues to rest on the prairie, indifferent to what you eat or how you prepare it. Below, food and shelter work together to carry you through another stretch of winter. You wipe your hands and breathe in once more. The smell no longer stands out, it simply exists, and in winter underground that is enough. Sound becomes an unreliable guide once you have lived underground long enough. You still hear, of course, but what reaches you has been filtered, softened, rearranged. Snow and soil reshape noise into something flatter, quieter, less urgent. At first, the silence feels unnatural. Later, it feels protective. You pause mid-movement and listen. The dugout holds a steady hush, broken only by the stove's low murmur and the faint shift of your own clothing. Outside, an entire prairie exists, but very little of it announces itself down here. Wind passes overhead without complaint. Snow falls without a whisper. Even storms lose their authority before they reach you. People who lived through prairie winters often noted how sound disappeared once the ground froze and snow settled deep. Travel journals mentioned sleds passing only a few yards away without being heard. Voices carried poorly. Life above became strangely detached from life below. This quiet was not imagined. It was structural. You test it, sometimes tapping a tool lightly against the wall. The sound dies quickly, swallowed by earth. The dugout does not echo, it absorbs. That quality makes the space feel smaller but calmer. Loud emotions have nowhere to bounce. You notice how your own voice changes. You speak more softly now, even when alone. There is no reason to raise it. Shouting feels out of place, almost wasteful. The walls do not encourage it. There is a small comfort in knowing that very little escapes from this place. Smoke leaves, but sound stays. From above, the dugout is nearly invisible in winter. From below, the outside world feels distant and muted. That separation reduces worry you did not realize you carried. Some winter accounts describe people feeling uneasy when silence became too complete. The absence of sound made them wonder if the world had stopped. Others describe the opposite, a relief from constant sensory demand. The records never settle on one experience. Silence amplified whatever mood already existed. You adjust your movements accordingly. Tools are placed gently, doors open slowly, sudden noise startles you more than it once did. Your body has grown accustomed to a quieter environment. There is an overlooked habit mentioned in a few personal recollections. People sometimes created small deliberate sounds to reassure themselves. A spoon tapped against a pot, a foot shuffled. Not for communication, just confirmation that sound still existed. You catch yourself doing this once, brushing your hand along the wall as you pass. Snow plays its role patiently. It muffles hooves, wheels, voices, and weather. Even danger arrives quietly in winter. That knowledge keeps you attentive without making you anxious. You listen for signs that matter. A sudden crack from above could signal shifting weight. A drip might mean thaw. These sounds cut through the quiet, immediately sharp with meaning. Everything else fades into the background. Time stretches in this silence. Without auditory markers, hours blur together. You rely on internal cues instead. Hunger, fatigue, the stove's rhythm. Silence becomes a canvas rather than a void. There has been discussion among later interpreters about whether this muted environment helped or harmed mental well-being. Some argue it reduced stress by limiting stimulation. Others suggest it intensified introspection to uncomfortable levels. The difference seems to depend on personality more than environment. You sit down and rest your hands on your knees, letting stillness surround you. Silence feels full rather than empty. It presses lightly like snow on sod, shaping without crushing. Above you, animals move quietly across frozen ground. Below you remain unaware unless they step directly overhead. The prairie carries on its business without involving you. You realize that this quiet has changed how you remember sound. Summer memories feel louder now. Wind feels sharper in recollection. Winter underground recalibrates your senses. You stand again and resume your tasks, moving smoothly, deliberately. There is no rush to fill the silence. It is doing important work on its own. As evening approaches, the quiet deepens further. Darkness and silence arrive together, reinforcing each other. You welcome them both. The dugout rests inside that stillness like a held breath. You exist within it, alert but calm, sheltered. Not just from cold, but from noise itself, and in that quiet winter feels manageable. Work loses its edges underground. Without clocks or visible daylight, tasks stop lining up in neat order. You no longer think in hours, you think in needs. When the stove cools, you tend it. When hunger appears, you cook. When the air feels heavy, you refresh it. The day arranges itself around signals rather than schedules. You pause mid-task and realize you cannot say exactly how long you've been awake. It does not matter. The dugout does not reward speed, it rewards attentiveness. Rushing only leads to mistakes that cost more time later. Many settlers on the prairie lived this way, even above ground during winter, but underground it became unavoidable. Without windows or consistent light, formal timekeeping lost its usefulness. Watches existed, of course, but they were not consulted often. Winter routines followed temperature, fuel use, and bodily cues rather than measured hours. You move from one task to the next without labelling them as morning or afternoon. Mending happens when your hands are warm enough. Cleaning happens when light allows it. Rest happens when your body asks for it. This fluid structure feels disorienting at first. Later it feels efficient. You sweep the floor, slowly gathering dirt and ash together. The motion is repetitive, calming. You stop when your back signals enough. You do not push past it. There is no prize for exhaustion here. Some personal accounts describe people feeling oddly productive despite accomplishing fewer visible tasks. Others describe the opposite, a sense that days slipped away unnoticed. The contrast appears again and again in winter records. Life without clocks suited some minds better than others. You take a break to warm your hands near the stove, then return to work. This rhythm repeats throughout the day. Short bursts of effort followed by rest. The dugout encourages this pattern. Space limits how much you can do at once. Heat fluctuates. Attention narrows. There is a small habit you notice yourself developing. You line tools up carefully after each use, not because you're orderly by nature, but because searching wastes energy. Everything has a place. Everything returns to it. This quiet discipline shapes your work without demanding thought. You repair a crack in the wall where clay has dried unevenly. You press fresh soil into the gap, smoothing it with water and your palm. This kind of maintenance never appears in heroic accounts of frontier life, but it fills winter days. The dugout requires constant small acts of care. Later interpretations of dugout living sometimes frame this labour as relentless. Other readings suggest it was simply continuous rather than exhausting. The distinction matters. Constant attention does not always mean constant strain. Much of this work happens at a calm pace woven into rest. You notice how hunger arrives gradually now without urgency. Your body adapts to the rhythm. You eat when it makes sense, not when a bell would have rung. Meals become markers, but flexible ones. Outside, the sun rises and sets without your participation. You know it happens, but you do not track it closely. Snow reflects light differently anyway. Brightness above does not translate below. You are insulated from the sky's schedule. There is something freeing in this separation. You are not late. You are not early. You are simply engaged. Tasks end when they are finished, not when time says they should. You sit down and rest, leaning against the wall. Rest is not scheduled either. It happens when muscles soften and breath deepens. You close your eyes for a moment, then open them again without fully sleeping. These pauses punctuate the day naturally. Some settlers wrote the winter underground felt like one long day rather than many separate ones. Memory blurred, events merged. That blurring worried some later readers who equated it with monotony. Others recognized it as a coping mechanism, a way of smoothing hardship. You returned to work refreshed, not rushed. You sought supplies, check food stores, rotate items closer to warmth or farther from it. These adjustments happen continuously. Nothing stays fixed for long. A task interrupts another, and that is acceptable. You stop mending to tend the stove. You stop cleaning to open the door briefly for air. There is no hierarchy of importance. Everything contributes to the same goal. You realize that this way of working changes how you think about effort. You no longer measure success by how much you complete. You measure it by how stable conditions remain. A good day is one where nothing deteriorates. That idea appears quietly in several winter recollections. People judge days by absence of trouble rather than presence of progress. No leaks, no illness, no fuel shortages, that was enough. You finish one task and pause unsure what comes next. You listen to your body and the room. The stove hums steadily, the air feels clear. Hunger has not returned yet, that means rest fits. You sit back and let your hands relax in your lap. The dugout feels calm, balanced. Work has not disappeared. It has simply lost its urgency. Outside time marches on. Inside it drifts. You exist within that drift, attentive but unpressured. Winter continues its long hold on the prairie, but underground life follows its own quieter rhythm. And without ever checking a clock, the day moves forward exactly as it should. Low ceilings change how energy moves through a space, especially when children share it with you. Adults learn quickly where to bend, where to pause, when not to stand up too fast. Children learn differently. They test the limits with their bodies, bouncing, crouching, stretching, forgetting, and then remembering again. You watch a child duck instinctively beneath a beam, not because you warned them, but because they learn through repetition. This space teaches without explanation. Bruised foreheads are rare after the first weeks. Memory adjusts, bodies adapt. Families who overwintered in dugouts often describe children becoming quieter indoors, not subdued but contained. There was less room to run for fewer places to hide. Energy found other paths. Hands stayed busy, voices softened. Games shrank to fit the space available. You hand over a small task, something simple. Sorting beans, folding cloth. Children participate because there is nowhere else for them to go. Work blends into play without ceremony. No one announces responsibility. It arrives naturally. Restlessness still appears. Winter does not erase it. It reshapes it. You notice fidgeting during long evenings, feet, swinging fingers, tracing patterns in the dirt floor. Instead of correcting it, you allow it. Movement finds its own scale underground. Some family letters describe children drawing on the walls with charcoal or bits of soft stone. The marks faded quickly, brushed away, or absorbed by the earth itself. No permanent damage, no scolding needed. The dugout forgave these small expressions easily. There is no single picture of how children experience winter underground. Some recollections emphasize closeness and shared routines. Others hint at tension and boredom. The difference seems tied to how adults manage their own patience. Children reflected what they saw. You notice how sound shifts when smaller bodies move through the space. Footsteps soften, laughter dampens, even excitement feels muted by the walls. This containment can feel calming or confining sometimes, both within the same hour. You adjust expectations accordingly. Outdoor freedom is not an option most days. Instead, you offer structure. Meals at familiar intervals, story told repeatedly, predictable patterns that reduce friction. A detail surfaces in a few winter accounts. Parents sometimes rearranged furniture weekly, not for novelty, but to change movement patterns. A table shifted, a bed rotated. These small changes refresh the space without altering its limits. You sit close together in the evenings. Proximity becomes normal. Personal space contracts. Touch replaces distance. This closeness feels natural after weeks underground. It stops registering as unusual. Some later readers assume this constant closeness would strain families beyond tolerance. Other interpretations point out that physical proximity did not always equal emotional pressure. In some cases, it reduced conflict by eliminating avoidance. Issues surfaced quickly and resolved or settled just as fast. You notice how children sleep heavier underground. Darkness arrives early and stays complete. Noise rarely interrupts rest. The earth muffles everything. Sleep deepens. You tuck blankets, carefully layering warmth without weight. You have learned how much is enough. Children rarely complain about cold here. The dugout holds temperature steadily and bodies adjust. Morning brings the same contained energy. Children wake without sunlight cues, guided by routine and hunger. They adapt quickly, asking fewer questions about time than adults do. You include them in daily maintenance. Packing clay, checking for damp spots, holding tools. These tasks ground them in the space. Participation replaces boredom. There are moments when restlessness spills over. Voices rise, movements collide. You pause and let the energy pass rather than suppress it. The space cannot expand, but attention can. You remind yourself that winter underground is not meant to feel easy, it is meant to feel workable. Children learn that difference early. As the day settles again, the dugout grows quieter. Small bodies find stillness, adults move carefully. The space returns to balance. Above you, snow continues to press down on the prairie, indifferent to age or movement. Below you shape daily life to fit low ceilings and limited room finding. The adaptation itself becomes a form of care. In this contained world, children grow not outward but inward, learning patience, awareness, and the shape of shelter long before they understand the words for it. Illness feels closer underground. not because it appears more often, but because there is less space to ignore it. A cough does not fade into the background. A fever changes the whole rhythm of the room. You notice small shifts quickly sometimes before the person affected does. You pause when you hear breathing sound different. Not louder, not laboured, just off. Winter sharpens this awareness. In a dugout, bodies share air constantly. Warmth circulates. So do whatever else people carry with them. You reach for extra blankets without comment. Warmth is the first response to almost everything here. You adjust the stove slightly, not enough to dry the air, just enough to steady it. Comfort matters more than diagnosis. Winter records from Prairie settlements show that people relied heavily on observation rather than medicine during long cold seasons. Doctors were distant. Remedies were local. Families tracked health through behaviour. Appetite, sleep, energy. These signs mattered more than names for illness. You offer warm liquid and encourage rest. The dugout supports this easily. Darkness and quiet come naturally. There is no pressure to perform or continue working when the body resists. Work waits. You clean more carefully when sickness appears, not obsessively but attentively. Dishes are dried immediately, cloths are rotated, air is refreshed a little more often. These actions are not dramatic, but they create a sense of control. Some winter diaries mention people placing beds closest to the stove during illness, even if it crowded the room further. Comfort outweighed inconvenience. Space rearranged itself around need. There is disagreement among later analysts about whether dugout living increased the spread of illness due to close quarters or reduced it by limiting exposure to harsh cold and wind. Personal experiences vary. Some families reported frequent sickness. Others recalled long winters with hardly any. You notice how quickly the atmosphere changes when someone feels unwell. Movements slow, voices soften further. The dugout responds as a whole. Everyone adjusts without discussion. You rest more yourself even if you feel fine. Fatigue invites illness. Winter teaches this gently but firmly. You do not push against it. A small habit appears almost unconsciously. You wash your hands more often, warming water first so the act does not feel punishing. Cleanliness here is practical rather than moral. It reduces risk. That is enough reason. You keep track of days differently when illness is present. You count improvements rather than time passed. A deeper breath. A steadier appetite. Longer rest without interruption. These become markers of progress. Some letters describe winter sickness feeling heavier emotionally than physically. Isolation magnified concern. Without neighbours nearby, responsibility felt absolute. You feel that weight now, but it does not overwhelm you. You respond step by step. You adjust food choices, favouring simple warm meals. The dugout fills with gentle steam. The smell feels comforting rather than intrusive. Warmth and nourishment do quiet work together. As night approaches, you listen carefully before sleeping. Breathing steadies. The stove hums. The dugout holds its balance. You allow yourself rest. Outside, winter remains indifferent. Snow covers the prairie without regard for health or recovery. Inside, attention and care shape a small pocket of safety. You wake during the night, briefly checking the fire, listening again. Everything sounds still. You lie back down and let sleep return. Illness underground does not arrive with panic. It arrives with vigilance, with patience, with an understanding that survival depends not on strength alone, but on noticing small changes early. By morning, the room feels calmer. Recovery may not be complete, but it has begun. In winter, that is enough to move forward. Small repairs interrupt the day without asking permission. You notice them because you have learned to look. A hairline crack in the wall where yesterday there was none. A soft patch near the doorway where moisture has gathered. These are not emergencies yet, but winter teaches you not to wait until they are. You gather clay and water, mixing them slowly in your hands. The texture tells you when it is right. Too dry and it will crumble. Too wet and it will slump. You press the mixture into the crack, smoothing it with your thumb until it blends back into the wall. The repair disappears almost immediately, but the effort matters. People living in dugouts spent a surprising amount of time on this kind of work. Letters and recollections describe constant attention to walls, roofs and floors, especially during freeze and thaw cycles. Earth structures shift, they breathe. Ignoring small changes invited larger ones. You move to the doorway next, checking where wood meets soil. This seam demands vigilance. You pack fresh earth into a shallow gap, tamping it firm. The door closes more snugly afterward. Drafts reduce, heat holds. These repairs never feel finished. They feel maintained. The dugout is not a static shelter. It responds to weather, weight, and time. You respond in return. This exchange defines winter living underground. There is no single agreement among later writers about whether dugouts required more maintenance than above-ground cabins. Some accounts suggest the opposite, noting fewer broken boards and less wind damage. Others emphasize constant soil management. Both perspectives appear valid, shaped by soil-type construction quality and winter severity. You check the roof support next, running your hand along the beam. It feels dry and solid. Snow above adds weight, but also stability. You trust the structure not blindly, but through repeated confirmation. A small habit appears in several winter recollections. People tapped beams or pressed walls daily, not to fix anything, but to feel resistance. Touch replaced visual inspection. Underground, you rely on your hands as much as your eyes. You notice how repairs shift the mood of the space. After patching a crack, the room feels calmer, even though nothing visible has changed. Addressing potential problems restores balance. Anxiety fades. You wipe your hands clean and sit back. The stove hums. The air feels steady. The dugout holds. These moments of maintenance fill hours without drawing attention to themselves. They rarely appear in dramatic retellings of frontier life, but they occupy real days. Winter underground is shaped more by upkeep than by adventure. You think briefly about how the prairie looks above you right now. Snow smooths everything, hiding imperfections. Below you do the opposite. You seek them out and correct them early. Some families recorded feeling oddly proud of their dugouts by late winter, not because they were beautiful, but because they had been kept functional through care rather than force. That pride did not announce itself. It settled quietly. You move on to another small task, adjusting a shelf that has begun to tilt. You wedge a flat stone beneath one leg. The shelf steadies, the fix takes seconds, the benefit lasts weeks. There is a rhythm to this work. Notice, act, return to rest. It repeats until it becomes background noise. You no longer resent the interruptions. You expect them. As afternoon fades, you check the repairs once more. The clay has set enough to hold. The door seals cleanly. The beam remains firm. Nothing else demands attention right now. You allow yourself to stop. That is part of the rhythm too. Constant vigilance does not mean constant labor. It means readiness. Outside winter continues to apply pressure through snow and cold. Inside you counter it with small, timely responses. The dugout and the season remain in conversation, balanced through effort rather than resistance. You lean back against the wall and feel its solidity. The repair blends seamlessly. The earth holds. For another day, that is enough. Isolation settles in quietly. It does not arrive as fear or panic. It arrives as distance. Distance from neighbours you know exist somewhere beyond the snow. Distance from news, from movement, from any sense that the world is changing quickly. The prairie feels paused, and you are paused with it. You sit and think about the last time you saw another household. The memory feels farther away than it probably is. Snow stretches space as effectively as miles ever could. Paths disappear, landmarks vanish. Everything looks the same from above, and from below you see nothing at all. Yet the isolation does not feel empty. Inside the dugout, life is dense. Sound, smell, warmth and presence all press close. You're alone from the outside world, but rarely alone within your own routines. During harsh winters, many prairie families went weeks without seeing anyone beyond their immediate household. Letters written in spring mention this matter-of-factly, as if it were simply another weather condition. Isolation was expected. Planning assumed it. No one waited for rescue or relief. You think about neighbours now not as people you'll visit soon, but as parallel lives unfolding under their own roofs of sod and snow. That thought brings comfort. Somewhere nearby, others are tending stoves, rotating blankets, watching walls for cracks. You're not unique. You're part of a scattered pattern. You talk less now even when others are present. Conversation becomes economical. Words matter, but silence matters too. Shared quiet feels easier than filling space with noise. No one takes offence. Silence carries meaning here. Some winter accounts describe people becoming deeply reflective during long periods without outside contact. Others describe the opposite, an almost complete narrowing of thought to immediate needs. Both experiences appear again and again, sometimes within the same household. Isolation magnifies what is already there. You notice how memory changes. Recent events fade quickly. Distant memories sharpen. Summer feels vivid, detailed, unreal. Winter feels ongoing, continuous, hard to separate into parts. Time loses texture. A small habit forms without intention. You revisit the same stories in your mind, replaying them until details shift slightly. Memory becomes something you work with, not something fixed. This repetition fills space that conversation once occupied. You also talk to yourself more, quietly, without embarrassment. Hearing a voice, even your own, feels grounding. You comment on tasks, you narrate repairs, you acknowledge small successes out loud. It keeps the day moving. Some people wrote later that they felt closer to themselves after winters like this. Others wrote that they felt diminished, reduced. The contrast resists easy explanation. Isolation does not create character so much as reveal it. You remain aware of risk. Injury would be serious. Illness would be harder without help. This awareness sharpens attention but does not overwhelm you. You move carefully. You rest when needed. You plan ahead because no one is coming quickly. Food tastes more meaningful when shared. Even simple meals feel deliberate. Eating together becomes a ritual not because you decide it should be, but because it anchors the day. Without visitors, shared moments carry extra weight. You sometimes imagine footsteps outside only to realize it is the stove settling or snow shifting on the roof. The mind fills gaps when stimulation drops. You accept this without alarm. Imagination stretches when the world stays still. There is still no single understanding among later readers about whether this isolation strengthened communities in the long term or eroded them. Some families emerged tightly bonded, others scattered as soon as winter loosened its grip. The season revealed fault lines that were already present. You find yourself listening for sounds that will not come. Wagon wheels, voices, dogs barking. When none appear, you return to your tasks. Expectation fades with repetition. The dugout becomes the center of your social world. Every interaction happens here. Every tension surfaces here. Every comfort is found here. That concentration intensifies experience without expanding it. You notice how quickly you adapt. What once felt like isolation now feels normal. The absence of contact becomes part of the landscape like snow or cold. You stop waiting for change and focus on continuity. Evenings feel the most isolated. Darkness arrives early and stays complete. You light the lamp and let its small circle define the world. Outside disappears entirely. Inside remains full. You think about spring, but not with urgency. Spring will come when it comes. Winter does not reward impatience. You have learned that. Isolation underground is not dramatic. It does not shout. It whispers, asking whether you are comfortable with your own company and the company you keep. You answer not with words, but with routine. You rest, you work, you eat, you listen. Days pass without markers, but they pass. The dugout holds steady, the snow holds steady, life continues quietly. And in that quiet, you realize that loneliness and isolation are not the same thing. One depends on absence, the other depends on meaning. Underground in winter, meaning is built from what remains, not from what is missing. When the door stays shut for days at a time, movement turns inward. You stop thinking about roads and distances and begin travelling through memory instead. Stories rise naturally in this kind of stillness. not as entertainment planned in advance, but as a way to stretch time and keep it from pressing too hard. You sit close to the stove-light low and let a story surface without announcing it. Someone begins speaking halfway through a thought and no one asks for the beginning. That is how stories work here. They do not need structure. They need presence. Winter households on the prairie relied heavily on spoken memory once travel became impossible. Letters and newspapers stopped arriving. News slowed to nothing. In that absence, stories filled the gap, carrying information, humour, warning, and comfort all at once. Oral exchange mattered more than accuracy. You notice how voices change when the room is quiet. They soften. Cadence stretches. Pauses grow longer without feeling awkward. Listening becomes easier when there is nothing else to attend to. Even familiar stories feel different underground. Someone tells a story you have heard before, but details shift slightly. The ending changes. A name disappears. No one corrects it. Accuracy is not the goal. The shape of the story matters more than its precision. You add a small detail when it is your turn, something remembered, something imagined. The line between the two blurs without consequence. Memory is flexible here. It adapts to the mood of the room. A habit mentioned quietly in a few winter recollections involves people saving certain stories for the coldest nights. Tales of warmer seasons, of journeys completed, of things that moved freely across open land. These stories were not meant to make winter feel shorter. They were meant to remind people that winter was not permanent. There is no agreement among later readers about whether storytelling served primarily as distraction or emotional regulation. Accounts point both ways. Some describe laughter easing tension. Others describe stories sharpening longing. Both effects appear sometimes back to back. You notice how children listen differently underground. Eyes track firelight rather than faces. Bodies relax into the dirt floor. Questions wait until the end if they come at all. Stories become something you absorb rather than interrogate. Silence returns between voices, but it feels full now. The room carries the residue of words like warmth after the stove door closes. No one rushes to fill it again. You think about travel you once took for granted. Walking to a neighbour's house, riding out to check land, visiting town, then those movements feel distant, almost fictional. Stories replace them, allowing you to go somewhere without leaving your seat. Some evenings, stories drift into songs, not formal ones, just fragments remembered and repeated. Lyrics break off, melodies soften. No one worries about finishing. Sound matters more than completion. You feel how these moments knit the household together. Shared stories become reference points. Inside jokes form. Phrases repeat. Meaning condenses. This shared language replaces the wider world for a time. Later observers sometimes assume that such winters dulled imagination. Others notice the opposite, that confinement sharpened it. Listening closely, it is clear that the imagination did not shrink. It turned inward and layered itself. You add wood to the stove and listen to the fire respond. The story pauses, then resumes flowing around the sound without breaking. Everything here adapts to everything else. As the evening deepens, voices trail off naturally. No one announces an ending. Stories simply dissolve into quiet, leaving impressions rather than conclusions. You lean back and let the room settle again. The dugout feels warmer now, not from the fire, but from shared attention. Outside travel has been replaced by interior movement, and it works. Snow still seals the prairie. Roads still do not exist. But inside you have gone places anyway. That is enough to carry you through another night. You become aware of animals mostly through absence. The absence of sound where sound once existed. The absence of movement you used to track instinctively. Winter redraws the prairie in a way that lifts most life up and away from you, leaving only traces that pass overhead and never announce themselves. You sit quietly and imagine what is happening above the roof of sodden snow. Livestock stand with heads low, conserving energy, shifting weight slowly, so hooves do not sink too deeply. Chickens huddle together nearly silent. Wild animals move cautiously, paths etched briefly into snow before filling in again. You do not see any of this, but you know it is happening because it always does. People who lived through these winters wrote very little about animals during the coldest months, and that absence is telling. Summer journals are full of descriptions, complaints, observations. Winter entries focus inward. Animals fade into the background, becoming part of the environment rather than daily interaction. You hear the rare sound when something steps directly over the dugout. A muffled thud, a slow scrape. The vibration feels closer than it should intimate in a way that startles you at first. Then you realize how thin the separation truly is. A few inches of soil, a layer of sod, snow pressed flat. That is all that lies between you and the open prairie. You pause listening until the sound passes. The animal does not know you are here. From above, the dugout disappears completely once snow settles. The land smooths itself, erasing edges and entrances. This invisibility offers comfort. You are hidden without trying to be. There are moments when you imagine animals lingering longer than they do. You picture deer pausing ears, turning, sensing warmth below. In truth, most creatures avoid areas that feel hollow beneath the snow. Instinct guides them away. That instinct protects you as much as it protects them. You think about livestock differently now. When you do go outside briefly, you move with purpose. You check quickly, feed efficiently, return underground. Exposure costs heat. Animals endure it longer, but even they conserve movement in winter. Everyone shares the same goal: spend less, preserve more. Some winter accounts describe people talking to animals more during these months, not because animals responded, but because voices felt useful. Sound anchored the moment. You find yourself doing this once, speaking quietly while checking a latch, then stopping without embarrassment. It felt natural. You also notice how smells change. Above ground, animals carry strong scents. Underground, those smells rarely reach you. Snow traps them. Cold dulls them. The dugout remains dominated by earth and smoke. This separation reinforces the sense that human life has folded inward for the season. There is no clear agreement in surviving descriptions about how much wildlife activity actually continued during the deepest winter. Some remembered tracks everywhere. Others remembered weeks of blank snow. Conditions varied year to year. Memory softened extremes. What remains consistent is how little it mattered to daily life underground. You rest and listen again. Nothing moves overhead now. The prairie feels paused, not empty, just waiting. You imagine animals bedding down, sharing body heat the way you do. The parallel feels obvious once you notice it. In warmer months, animals demanded attention. Fences broke, crops were threatened, noise travelled. Winter removes those concerns almost entirely. Care narrows, focus sharpens. You feel a faint vibration, once more lighter this time. Perhaps wind shifting adrift. Perhaps something small crossing quickly. You do not investigate. Curiosity wastes energy. The dugout teaches restraint. Some people remembered winter nights when wolves howled in the distance, sound travelling far over frozen ground. Others never heard a thing. Snow and terrain shaped sound unpredictably. Underground, even those calls would arrive muted, more imagined than heard. You realize how much of animal life now exists only in your thoughts. Memory supplies movement where observation cannot. You recall summer mornings filled with birds. You recall cattle lowing. These sounds feel exaggerated in memory, louder than they ever were. The dugout creates a clear boundary. Inside is human rhythm. Outside is animal rhythm. The two overlap only rarely in winter. That separation brings relief. You're not competing for resources. You're not defending territory. You're waiting. You adjust your blanket and settle deeper into the space. The earth holds steady. Snow presses gently. Somewhere above, life continues without intersecting yours. This layered existence feels strange at first, then normal. You accept that you are not the center of the prairie right now, and you are a quiet pocket beneath it. As night deepens, the sense of being below everything else grows stronger. Stars shine unseen, animals move unseen, weather changes unseen. All of it passes over you without demand. You breathe slowly and feel grounded in a literal way. Earth supports you, snow insulates you. Animals pass above without noticing. This anonymity feels safe. Winter does not require dominance or mastery. It rewards stillness. Animals understand this instinctively. Underground, you are learning it too. You close your eyes and let the imagined movement above fade. The dugout remains your world for now. The prairie can wait. Snowstorms redraw your boundaries without asking for consent. One day the door opens with effort. The next it refuses entirely. Snow piles itself against the entrance until wood and earth feel fused together. You press your shoulder against it and feel only resistance. That tells you everything you need to know. Today is a waiting day. You do not feel trapped. That word belongs to sudden events. This is gradual. You knew it was coming when the wind shifted and the light flattened. Snowstorms announce themselves in stages, and you learned long ago to listen. Inside the dugout feels unchanged. Warmth holds. Air moves slowly. The stove continues its quiet work. Outside access shrinks, but interior life remains intact. This contrast defines winter underground. The world closes in while your space stays livable. You sit back and accept the boundary as it stands. Snow has decided where you can go. Fighting it would cost more energy than it is worth. You can serve instead. People who overwintered on the plains learned this rhythm quickly. Storm days were not for productivity or travel. They were for maintenance, rest, and patience. Journals often mention storms briefly, then move on to interior concerns, as if the weather were background rather than an event. You check supplies without urgency. Food is sufficient. Fuel is stacked where it should be. Water is accessible. There is no reason to open the door just to prove you can. The dugout does not require bravery, it requires judgment. Snow changes how sound behaves outside. Wind may roar above, but below it feels distant. Pressure replaces noise. You sense the storm more through vibration than sound. The roof bears weight steadily, not alarmingly. Snow settles rather than strikes. You listen for shifts that matter. A sudden thump might signal a slide. A slow creak might suggest uneven weight. Nothing like that happens. The storm behaves itself. You relax into the waiting. There are stories of people becoming restless during long storms, pacing the same few steps until the space felt smaller than it was. Other accounts describe storms as welcome interruptions, forcing rest in a world that usually demanded constant attention. The difference often came down to how much preparation had been done beforehand. You choose a task that fits the day. Sorting, mending, cleaning areas that usually receive less attention. These activities fill time without demanding much heat or focus. They match the energy of the storm rather than opposing it. You notice how light behaves differently during heavy snowfall. Even without windows, the quality of illumination shifts. The dugout feels dimmer, as if the sky itself has lowered. You adjust the lamp slightly and continue. A small habit emerges on storm days. You check the same places repeatedly. Door, stove, roof beam, not because you expect change, but because repetition reassures. Each check confirms stability. Stability quiets the mind. You think briefly about what lies beyond the snow. Fences buried, paths erased, distances stretched. The prairie becomes abstract during storms reduced to white and movement. Down here, details remain intact. The contrast sharpens appreciation for small, solid things. There is no consensus in recollections about how long storms felt to those waiting them out. Some remembered hours feeling endless. Others remembered storms passing quickly, time blurred by routine. Memory stretches and compresses under snow the way land does. You eat simply conserving fuel, warm food, not elaborate. The stove burns low and steady. You resist the urge to add more wood just for comfort. Comfort comes from predictability more than heat. As the day progresses, snow continues to build outside. Inside, nothing deteriorates. That is the measure of success. Winter living underground is less about advancing and more about holding ground. You lie down briefly not to sleep but to rest your body. The dugout supports this easily. Darkness and quiet arrive without effort. Rest does not feel like surrender. It feels appropriate. You wake again after some time and listen. The storm still presses, but its tone has shifted. The pressure feels more even. Wind has softened. Snow is settling rather than moving. These signs suggest the storm is nearing its end. You do not rush to open the door when the pressure eases. Snowstorms leave behind drifts that need time to stabilize. Opening too soon invites collapse. You wait. There is something instructive about being forced to wait. It teaches you which impulses matter and which do not. You realize how often movement is driven by habit rather than necessity. Winter strips that away. Some families recorded using storm days as opportunities to plan spring work mentally, if not on paper. Others avoided thinking ahead, focusing entirely on the present. Both approaches appear in winter writings. Neither was universally better. You choose presence. You focus on the stove, the walls, the quiet. The dugout holds steady under the weight above. Snow does its work slowly without malice. When the storm finally releases its hold, it does so quietly. No announcement, just a subtle change in pressure. You feel it before you hear anything. The world loosens its grip. You test the door gently. It still resists, but differently now. Snow has stopped adding weight. Digging can wait until light improves. For now, you remain where you are. The storm has rewritten your boundaries for a time, and you accepted them without struggle. That acceptance saved energy, preserved warmth, and kept you safe. Snowstorms do not interrupt life underground, they define it. They remind you that survival here is not about pushing outward, but about knowing when stillness is the strongest response. You settle back into the quiet and let the last of the storm pass over you. The prairie will reappear when it is ready. Until then, the dugout remains enough. At some point, you stop noticing the smell of earth. It does not disappear. It simply loses its sharpness, blending into everything else, until it feels like a background note rather than a presence. Smoke-damp soil wool and cooked food overlap until no single scent stands out for long. You remember how it struck you at first, the heaviness, the way it clung to your clothes and hair, the sense that you were breathing something unfinished. That reaction fades gradually, not because the smell changes, but because you do. Your body recalibrates what normal means. Underground winter living brings this adjustment quickly. Earth walls and floors release moisture and scent constantly. The dugout is not sealed in the modern sense. It exhales. That steady exchange fills the air with a low, persistent odour that cannot be scrubbed away. People who stayed long enough stopped trying. You sit quietly and inhale without thinking about it. The smell feels neutral now, almost comforting. It signals stability. When it shifts noticeably, you pay attention. A sour note suggests standing water. A sharp mineral edge suggests fresh soil exposed somewhere. Scent becomes an early warning system. You move closer to the wall and place your hand against it. The earth feels cool and faintly damp. The smell here is stronger, richer. You do not recoil. You associate it with shelter, with walls that have held through snowstorms and cold snaps. In Earth's and early settlement writings, newcomers often complained about dugout odours. Later entries from the same writers rarely mention them at all. That silence is telling. Adaptation left fewer words behind than discomfort did. You notice how smell affects memory. Certain moments stick more firmly now because of scent rather than sight. A particular stew simmering during a storm, damp wool warming near the stove, fresh clay packed into a crack. These smells anchor experiences more deeply than images. You hang clothing where warm air passes gently. Fabric absorbs earth and smoke quickly. It never fully releases them. You stop expecting clean separation between environment and belongings. Everything here belongs to the same system. There are accounts of people sprinkling herbs or pine needles around their dugouts in winter, not to eliminate odour, but to add something familiar. These attempts were brief. The earth always returned to prominence. Over time, people let it. You pour warm water into a basin and wash your hands. The smell lingers faintly on your skin even after drying. You notice it less with each passing week. It feels less like residue and more like context. Later readers sometimes assume that constant earth smell would be unpleasant or unhealthy. Other interpretations point out that soil scent itself is not inherently harmful. The real issues came from moisture imbalance and smoke buildup, not from earth alone. Smell became a proxy for comfort rather than danger. You step back and look around. The dugout feels cohesive. Walls, floor, ceiling, and air all belong to one material story. Nothing feels out of place. That unity eases the mind. You realize that scent has replaced sight as your primary sense for certain judgments. You know when the stove is burning well by smell. You know when the air needs refreshing. You know when something has gone wrong before you see it. This awareness develops quietly. No one teaches it. It arrives through repetition. Underground life trains the senses it relies on most. You recall stepping outside briefly after a storm and being struck by how sharp the air felt. Clean, yes, but also aggressive. The dugout smell feels softer by comparison. Containing rather than cutting. You sit and rest, breathing evenly. The smell of earth settles around you like a blanket. It does not excite, it reassures. Some families later describe missing that smell once they moved into frame houses. They spoke of rooms feeling hollow, disconnected from the land. Others were relieved to leave it behind. Experience diverged sharply. What comforted one person unsettled another. You notice how smell changes with the seasons, even underground. Winter scent feels heavier, more mineral. Spring brings a faint sweetness as thaw begins. These shifts mark time more reliably than calendars. You stir the stove and add a small piece of fuel. Smoke briefly thickens the air, then clears. The earth scent remains constant beneath it. That consistency anchors the space. You think about how animals rely heavily on smell to navigate winter. Underground, you have adopted a similar awareness. You read the environment through scent because vision offers fewer clues. The dugout does not smell clean or dirty. It smells alive. That realization changes your relationship with it. You stop trying to impose outside standards and instead respond to what the space actually requires. You adjust a damp spot on the floor, sprinkling ash lightly. The smell shifts slightly, then settles. Balance restored. As evening approaches, scents deepen. Cooking warmth, moisture, and earth layer together. The dugout feels full, occupied, used. That fullness feels right. You lie back and let the air move slowly around you. Breathing feels easy, familiar. The smell no longer draws attention. It supports. Above you, snow continues to insulate the prairie. Below, earth continues to breathe. You exist in the middle of that exchange, adjusted to it now. Winter underground teaches you that comfort is not always about removal. Sometimes it is about acceptance. The smell of earth becomes part of you. And in that acceptance, the dugout feels less like shelter and more like home. Night stretches differently underground. Without windows, darkness does not arrive so much as deepen. The dugout does not change when evening comes. The walls remain the same. The stove glows steadily. Only your body signals that it is time to slow down. You settle yourself into a familiar position, arranging blankets by feel rather than sight. The earth beneath you holds a constant coolness balanced by layers of fabric and stored warmth. Sleep here is not dramatic. It arrives gradually, as if invited rather than demanded. People who slept in dugouts often describe nights as longer but quieter. Without wind rattling boards or branches scraping walls, rest was rarely interrupted by noise. The earth absorbed movement from above, turning what might have been sharp sounds into distant pressure. Sleep deepened because there was little to pull you out of it. You notice how your breathing changes once you lie still. Slower, heavier, the kind of breathing that belongs to rest rather than alertness. The stove's faint sound becomes background steady and predictable. That consistency matters more than silence. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb too much. Space teaches you to be economical even in sleep. You learn which movements wake you fully and which allow rest to continue. Your body memorizes the dugout's limits. There are moments during the night when you wake briefly, not from fear but from habit. You listen. You check the fire without opening your eyes fully. You confirm that everything feels as it should. Then you let yourself drift again. Some winter accounts suggest people slept more hours underground than they did above ground, especially during the coldest months. Others recall fragmented sleep broken into short stretches. Both patterns appear in memory shaped by stove management, household size, and individual temperament. No single rhythm fit everyone. You find that darkness feels complete here. Not threatening, complete. There are no distant lights, no moonlit shapes to distract you. The dugout contains night fully. That containment allows your thoughts to slow. A small habit forms without intention. You sleep with certain objects nearby, a tool, a cup, something solid within reach, not for use but for reassurance. Touch grounds you when sight offers nothing. You feel the weight of blankets and appreciate it. Weight signals safety to the body. The dugout adds to that sensation. Earth above, snow above that, layers working together. You rest inside them. Dreams shift in this environment. They feel heavier, slower, more physical. You dream of warmth, pressure, and closed spaces. Open landscapes appear less often. When they do, they feel exaggerated, almost unreal. Some later readers assume such dreams reflected anxiety. Others saw them as adaptation, the mind adjusting to the world it occupies. Underground dreams follow the same logic as waking life. They turn inward. You wake again briefly when the stove settles. The sound is soft, familiar. You do not sit up. You trust the system you have built. That trust allows rest to return quickly. Outside, the prairie lies under stars you cannot see. Cold deepens. Wind moves snow across open ground. None of it reaches you directly. The dugout filters everything. You think about how sleep above ground once felt. Lighter, more interrupted, more exposed. Underground sleep feels anchored. The earth presses gently, reminding your body that it is supported. You adjust a blanket and exhale slowly. The smell of earth and fabric surrounds you. It feels constant, unchanging. That constancy matters at night. Some people later describe missing this kind of sleep once they return to above-ground houses. Others welcomed the return of space and light. Memory divides here as it does elsewhere. Comfort is personal. You sink deeper into rest, no longer aware of the stove's rhythm or the passage of hours. Time loses its shape entirely during these stretches. Night becomes one long unbroken moment. Morning will come eventually, but it does not rush toward you. The dugout does not announce it. For now there is only darkness, warmth, and the steady presence of earth. You sleep. Fear does not arrive the way stories say it should. There is no sudden spike, no racing pulse that announces danger. Underground in winter, fear moves more like cold itself, gradual, peripheral, easy to ignore if you're not paying attention. You feel it first as a tightening in your habits. You double-check the stove even though it looks fine. You run your hand along the wall where you repaired it earlier, pressing a little harder than necessary. You listen longer before sleeping. None of this feels dramatic, it feels reasonable. Living beneath snow teaches you that most threats are slow. Roofs do not collapse without warning. Air does not turn bad all at once. Supplies do not vanish overnight. Problems build quietly, which means fear does too. People who kept winter journals often wrote very little about fear itself. Instead, they wrote about precautions, about habits that became stricter as winter deepened. Extra fuel kept closer, tools laid out more carefully, doors checked more often. Fear disguised itself as attention. You sit still and listen to your own body, breathing steady, hands warm enough, muscles relaxed. Fear has not settled in your chest, it has settled in your awareness. You think briefly about what would happen if something failed. The stove going cold, a sudden illness, a structural shift. You do not linger on these thoughts. You acknowledge them, then return to what you can control. Winter rewards that kind of thinking. Some recollections describe people feeling braver in spring than they had been in winter, not because danger disappeared, but because they had survived months of it quietly. Courage, it seems, did not come from bold action, but from sustained competence. You realize that fear underground has a purpose. It sharpens observation. It keeps you from carelessness. It does not demand panic. It demands respect. There are moments when imagination presses harder than reality. You wake at night and listen too closely, convinced you heard something shift. You wait. Nothing follows. The sound resolves into the stove settling or snow adjusting above. Fear dissolves as quickly as it formed. You do not chastise yourself for these moments. They are part of the environment. The mind fills gaps when sensory input narrows. Underground darkness and silence leave room for thought to wander. Some families remembered winters as anxious stretches. Others recalled them as calm. The difference rarely aligns with actual events. It aligns with temperament. Fear did not belong to the dugout. It belonged to the people inside it. You ground yourself in routine. Routine interrupts spirals. You check what can be checked. You adjust what can be adjusted. When nothing needs attention, you stop. A small habit emerges that you barely notice at first. You touch solid things more often. The wall, the beam, the stove, physical confirmation quiets abstract worry. Weight and resistance reassure you. This habit appears quietly in several winter recollections. People mention touching walls without explaining why, leaning against beams, sitting with backs pressed to earth. The body sought reassurance where the mind could not find it. Fear also changes your sense of time. When you are uneasy, minutes stretch. When you are occupied, hours disappear. You learn to stay busy enough to keep time moving, but not so busy that mistakes creep in. You notice how fear fades during storms. Once weather removes choice, uncertainty shrinks. You know you are staying inside. You know what must be done. Fear thrives on options. Winter reduces them. There is no clear agreement among later observers about whether dugout living heightened fear or diminished it overall. Some argue that confinement amplified worry. Others point out that reduced exposure simplified risk. Both interpretations appear in different accounts, sometimes from the same person remembering different winters. You sense that fear here is not a constant state. It comes and goes, responding to fatigue, hunger, or uncertainty. You learn to recognize its triggers. You rest when needed. You eat before hunger sharpens edges. You warm yourself before chill settles deep. You also learn that fear loses power when shared. A quiet comment, a nod, a mutual check of the door. No one names fear directly. You acknowledge it through action. At night, fear feels closer. Darkness removes distraction. You lie still and let your mind run briefly, then gently pull it back. You focus on breath, on warmth, on the steady presence of earth around you. You remind yourself of what is already held. The roof through storms, the walls through freeze and thaw, the stove through long nights. Evidence matters more than imagination. Some winter accounts mention people keeping small rituals at night. A prayer, a phrase repeated silently, a hand placed on the wall. These gestures were not about superstition, they were about focus. You fall asleep eventually, not because fear disappears, but because it softens. It becomes part of the background like cold outside or snow above, present but not overwhelming. By morning, fear has receded again. The dugout still stands. The stove still warms. The air still moves. Survival continues without announcement. You realize that fear underground is not an enemy to defeat. It is a signal to listen more carefully, to slow down, to respect the environment you depend on. Winter does not demand fearlessness. It demands steadiness. Underground, you learn the difference. Community does not vanish in winter. It changes form without visits, without shared meals across households. It survives mostly in worry and expectation. You carry neighbours with you even when you do not see them. Their presence exists as assumption rather than proof. You think about who might be awake right now in another dugout several miles away. Someone tending a stove, someone checking a door, someone listening to the same kind of quiet. These parallel actions create a sense of connection that does not require contact. Knowing others are doing the same work at the same time is enough. During the coldest months on the prairie, travel between homesteads often stopped entirely. Snow-buried trails, wind-erased landmarks, yet people continued to plan as if neighbours were still reachable. Spring tasks were discussed in advance. Tools were mentally promised. Help was assumed. Community extended forward in time when it could not function in the present. You notice how this imagined connection shapes your behaviour. You keep your supplies in order not only for yourself, but because disorder feels like letting others down somehow. You maintain the dugout because it represents your part of a larger pattern of survival. You speak of neighbours occasionally even when they are not present. Not with urgency. More as reminders. Someone would laugh at this, someone else solved a problem this way. These references keep people real. Some winter to recollection suggest that long isolation strengthened bonds once spring arrived. Others hint that distance created misunderstandings that never fully healed. Both outcomes appear. Winter did not decide the fate of relationships, simply paused them and then resumed them where they landed. You recall small details about nearby families, the way one person stacked firewood, the way another organised tools. These memories surface unprompted. They fill gaps where conversation once lived. There is a subtle comfort in knowing that no one expects anything from you right now beyond survival. No visits to prepare for, no schedules to keep. Obligation shrinks to essentials. That simplicity eases pressure. You imagine what it will feel like to open the door in spring and see another person approach across open ground. The thought feels distant but pleasant. You do not rush toward it. Anticipation sits quietly alongside routine. A small habit develops during long winters. You rehearse conversations in your mind, what you will say, what you will ask. These imagined exchanges keep social muscles from stiffening. They make the eventual return to community feel less abrupt. Some accounts describe people feeling awkward when contact resumed, as if they had forgotten how to speak easily. Others describe relief so strong it erased any discomfort. Experience varied. Winter shaped people differently. You continue daily routines with an awareness that they are not unique. Others are doing similar work under similar conditions. That shared effort links you even when snow prevents meeting. You take care to leave signs of readiness near the door. Tools accessible, paths remembered. The idea of connection remains active even if unused. As evening arrives, you think less about community and more about the immediate space. But the sense of belonging does not disappear. It settles deeper, becoming quieter and more stable. Outside the prairie lies empty of visible human life. Inside, community exists as memory, intention, and assumption. It is thinner than presence, but stronger than absence. You rest knowing that winter has not erased your place among others. It has simply folded it away for a time. When conditions change, it will unfold again. For now, that knowledge is enough. Change reaches you before you recognize it as change. It arrives quietly without light or colour to announce it. The dugout feels slightly different under your hand. The floor yields a little more than it did yesterday. Not enough to alarm you, just enough to notice. You pause and press your palm flat against the earth. It is softer now, still cool, still steady, but no longer rigid. The ground has begun to loosen its grip on winter. You feel it before you see anything outside confirm it. Air behaves differently too. Moisture lingers longer after cooking, breath feels less sharp, the stove works a little harder to keep the same warmth, not because it is colder, but because the ground is waking up. These signs arrive days or weeks before snow retreats in any visible way. People who live through prairie winters often mark the coming of spring by sensation rather than sight. Diaries mention mud appearing indoors before it appeared outside, doors swelling slightly, earth smelling sweeter, less mineral. These were the real indicators. Green was a distant rumour. You notice more drips now. Not constant, not alarming, but present. Meltwater finds new paths through soil and sod. You respond instinctively, redirecting moisture-packing clay where needed, laying ash where footing grows slick. This is not cleanup, it is transition. You begin adjusting routines without announcing it to yourself. Blankets shift position. Clothing rotates more often. The stove receives slightly more attention again. Winter demanded holding warmth. Early thaw demands managing excess. The dugout becomes more active. It moves, walls respond, floors shift subtly. Earth that once felt locked now feels conversational, asking for response rather than obedience. Some accounts remember this period as the most uncomfortable part of the year. Cold still lingered, but dampness returned. Other recollections describe relief. Winter's stillness broke. The environment felt alive again. The difference appears tied less to conditions than to temperament. You lift a mat and check beneath it. Moisture has darkened the soil slightly. You nod and adjust. Nothing here surprises you anymore. You have learned the dugout's language over the season, and this is simply another phrase. Smell changes first. The scent of earth grows richer, more organic. Smoke blends differently with it. Cooking odours linger longer. You breathe in and recognize it as movement rather than decay. Spring announces itself through scent. You think briefly about what this means for the prairie above. Snow still lies thick in places, but somewhere beneath it water is moving. Roots are preparing, animals are shifting patterns. All of that begins long before you see open ground. You find yourself opening the door slightly more often, not to go outside but to exchange air. The cold feels less punishing for short moments now. You close the door again and smile faintly at yourself. That impulse would have felt reckless weeks ago. Some families described this period as restless. Others described it as hopeful. Both appear in memory. Early spring underground brings work without the clarity of reward. You respond anyway. You rearrange storage areas, lifting items off the floor, anticipating moisture. Food moves higher. Tools shift location. The dugout evolves with the season, and you evolve with it. There is an odd satisfaction in catching these changes early. You feel ahead of the season rather than chased by it. Winter taught vigilance. Spring rewards it. You sit and listen. Sound changes too. Snow no longer absorbs everything. You hear faint dripping outside, muffled but distinct. The world above is beginning to speak again. Some later interpretations focus heavily on the hardship of this transitional period. Others emphasize its quiet optimism. The truth likely lives in both. Spring underground is not easy, but it is directional. Things are moving somewhere now. You feel that movement in your body. Muscles feel looser. Sleep shifts. Hunger arrives differently. You crave lighter food even if supplies still favor winter meals. Desire moves ahead of reality. You begin thinking about tasks that do not belong to winter. Repairing fences, checking land, visiting neighbours. These thoughts feel distant but no longer abstract. They have weight. At the same time, you remain grounded in the present. Mud and moisture demand attention. Spring can damage a dugout faster than winter if ignored. Thaw weakens what freeze made rigid. You stay attentive. A small habit returns without announcement. You clean boots more often. Winter grime gives way to damp soil that spreads quickly. You adapt. You press your ear briefly to the wall and listen. Somewhere above, water moves. Not loudly, not urgently, just persistently. That sound did not exist weeks ago. You realize that this is how seasons actually change. Not with scenes and announcements, but with texture, pressure, smell, sound. You allow yourself a moment of anticipation, then release it. Spring will arrive fully when it does. Rushing it gains nothing. Winter taught you patience. Spring asks for flexibility. You stand and stretch, feeling the ground respond beneath your feet. The dugout is no longer fully winter. It is becoming something else. Outside the prairie still looks frozen. Inside the earth has already decided to move forward. You follow its lead. Snow does not leave all at once. It loosens its hold in stages, retreating unevenly, giving up ground reluctantly. You notice this first, not through sight, but through sound. Drips grow more frequent. The roof shifts weight differently. The dugout feels lighter above your head, as if pressure has eased just enough to breathe. You test the door more often now. Not to open it fully, just to feel how it responds. Snow still presses back, but it no longer feels fused to the earth. It slides instead of resisting. That change matters. It means the prairie is beginning to release you. Inside, routines adjust again. You dry things more carefully, knowing moisture will linger longer during thaw. You sweep more often, not because the floor is dirtier, but because grit behaves differently when damp. Small habits shift without instruction. Your body remembers what comes next, even if your mind stays focused on the present. People who overwintered on the plains often described this period as strangely tiring. Winter stillness had demanded patience. Thaw demands attention. Things that stayed fixed now move. Doors swell, clay softens, roofs weep. The dugout asks for more involvement, not less. You kneel and check familiar seams pressing gently. The earth gives slightly, then holds. You add a bit of clay where needed, smoothing it with practiced ease. These actions feel routine now, almost comforting. They mark progress without requiring celebration. Outside, snow begins to collapse into itself. Drifts slump. Sharp edges round off. What once reflected light harshly now absorbs it. Even without stepping out, you sense this shift through changes in brightness filtering into the dugout. You open the door briefly and let cool air rush in. It smells different now. Less sharp. More wet. You close the door again and sit quietly, letting the air settle. That scent confirms what your hands already told you. Winter is no longer static. Some winter recollections treat this period with frustration, describing endless mud and inconvenience. Others describe it with relief, noting how movement returned to the land. Both reactions make sense. Thaw complicates life even as it promises change. You find yourself standing more often, stretching unconsciously. Muscles that spent months conserving energy now test themselves. You do not push. You simply notice capacity returning. The dugout sounds different at night. Water moves. Wood creaks with new rhythms. The stove's heat interacts with moisture in unfamiliar ways. You listen carefully, recalibrating what normal sounds like. You begin to think about clearing the doorway, fully planning the effort rather than executing it immediately. Timing matters. Too early and snow collapses back in. Too late and meltwater complicates everything. You wait for the right balance. There is a quiet satisfaction in recognizing these signs. You feel aligned with the season rather than reacting to it. Winter taught endurance. Thaw teaches judgment. You notice that silence has changed as well. Snow no longer absorbs sound completely. You hear distant movement, occasionally vague and indistinct. The prairie is waking but slowly. You adjust storage again, lifting items higher, anticipating dampness. These preparations feel familiar, like returning to a skill you already know. The dugout shifts from winter shelter to transitional space, preparing for openness. Some later readers imagined spring as a clear reward after winter hardship. Those who lived it knew better. Thaw brought its own challenges, but it also brought direction. Things were moving again, and movement itself felt hopeful. You sit and rest, listening to water trace its paths through soil and sod. The sound is gentle, persistent. It reminds you that change does not need force to be effective. Above you, snow continues to retreat inch by inch. Below you, adapt inch by inch. The dugout remains steady through it all, not resisting change, but accommodating it. You realize that winter is not ending so much as loosening. Its grip relaxes, allowing other seasons to be in their quiet work. You follow along, attentive and patient, ready for what comes next. Leaving the dugout feels stranger than entering it ever did. You expected relief, maybe even excitement, but what arrives instead is hesitation. The doorway opens wider now, snow finally cleared enough to allow passage, and the space beyond it feels oversized, almost excessive. You step outside, slowly squinting as light reaches you without filtering through earth and sod. The sky feels far away. Wind moves freely, again brushing your face with a cold that no longer feels hostile, just unfamiliar. After months of enclosure, openness requires adjustment. The prairie stretches outward in every direction, its surface uneven with melting drifts and dark patches of exposed ground. What once felt endless now feels loud. Sound travels again, footsteps crunch, water runs visibly. The world has texture you forgot was there. People who emerge from winter dugouts often described a brief sense of disorientation. Letters mention feeling watched by the sky or unsettled by distance. The shelter that once felt temporary became intimate, and leaving it required recalibration. You turn back and look at the dugout from outside for the first time in weeks. Snow still clings to parts of it, but the structure looks smaller than it felt from within. Its edges are modest, its presence subtle. You're surprised by how much of your winter it held without announcing itself. You breathe deeply. The air feels sharper now, less contained. Scents scatter instead of lingering. Earth smells different out here. Less concentrated, less personal. You realize how much you relied on smell inside to guide judgment. Outside it offers less information. You move cautiously across the ground, testing footing. Mud pulls at your boots. Snow collapses unpredictably. Movement requires attention again. Winter underground taught stillness. Outside balance returns as a skill you must reawaken. Some people remembered this first return to open space as exhilarating. Others remembered it as uncomfortable. Accounts pull in different directions. For some, the dugout had become a refuge. For others, it had been endured. Leaving meant different things depending on how winter was experienced. You take a few more steps, then stop. Your body feels exposed, not unsafe, just uncovered. There is no ceiling above you. No walls to lean against. You stretch instinctively, then let your arms fall back to your sides. Animals leave clearer signs now. Tracks crisscross the thawing ground. You see where deer passed, where something smaller darted. These marks feel fresh, active. Life has resumed its visible patterns. You listen and hear sounds that never reached you underground. Water trickling, wind shaping grass. A distant call carried clearly. The prairie has found its voice again. You realize that your pace has slowed. Underground living trained you to move deliberately. You do not rush now, even when space allows it. That habit stays with you, grounding your movements. You return briefly to the dugout and step inside once more. The contrast is immediate. Warmth closes around you. Sound softens. The space feels smaller but calmer. You stand there for a moment, appreciating both worlds without choosing between them. This back and forth repeats over the next days. You step outside, then return. Each time the outside feels less overwhelming. Each time the dugout feels less enclosing. Balance returns gradually. Some families describe lingering longer underground, even after conditions allowed above ground living. Others moved out quickly, eager for space. The difference reflects attachment more than necessity. You begin carrying dugout habits with you outside. You notice where warmth gathers in the open. You seek shelter from wind automatically. You remain attentive to ground texture and moisture. Winter has trained you, and the training does not disappear. As evening approaches, you step out once more and remain there longer. The sky shifts colour. Clouds move visibly. You watch without urgency. You are not required to retreat quickly anymore. You look back at the dugout and feel a quiet respect rather than relief. It did not save you through heroics. It saved you through steadiness. That lesson stays. Leaving the dugout is not an ending. It is a widening. The world expands, but you carry the enclosed season with you. Winter underground shaped how you move through open space now. You turn toward the prairie again and take another careful step forward, ready to let distance return one measured pace at a time. Some habits refuse to stay behind when you leave the dugout. You notice them first in small moments. You step into open air and still glance upward, half expecting a ceiling. You enter a larger space and instinctively choose the warmest corner. These reactions surface before thought catches up. You arrange objects with care now, even when space is plentiful. A chair placed where warmth gathers. Tools set within easy reach. You no longer scatter things casually. Underground living trained your hands to value order because disorder once had consequences. That training lingers. When the wind shifts across the prairie, you turn slightly without thinking, angling your body to protect exposed skin. Months of shelter taught you to respect airflow. The habit persists even when the cold has softened. People who moved out of dugouts in spring often remarked on this quiet carryover. Letters written later describe former dugout dwellers preferring smaller rooms, lower ceilings, and thicker walls even when options expanded. The dugout left an imprint that did not fade quickly. You find yourself checking doors twice. Not because danger feels present, but because closure once meant warmth and safety. That association stays embedded. You touch the latch lightly, then move on. Sleep changes too. In larger spaces you take longer to settle. Darkness feels thinner. Sound travels too freely. You miss the way Earth used to hold both. Eventually your body adapts again, but the transition takes time. There is a moment when you catch yourself touching a wall simply to feel its steadiness. The surface is different now, wood instead of earth, but the gesture remains. Weight and resistance still reassure you more than sight. Some people embraced these lingering habits. Others worked to unlearn them, eager to reclaim openness and movement. Experience varied. What remains clear is that dugout life shaped behavior in ways that extended beyond the season itself. You notice that patience has deepened. You wait longer before acting. You listen more before deciding. Underground living rewarded observation. That reward system stays intact. When weather turns rough again, even briefly, you respond differently than you once did. You prepare early, you reduce exposure, you do not test conditions unnecessarily. Winter taught you that endurance comes from respect rather than challenge. Food habits linger as well. You cook simpler meals even when variety returns. Warmth and reliability still matter more than novelty. The dugout adjusted your priorities quietly. You also notice a subtle gratitude towards a shelter of any kind. Roofs feel meaningful now. Walls feel protective. You no longer take enclosure for granted. It registers as an achievement rather than an assumption. Some former dugout dwellers reportedly returned to earth shelters during later hardships, not out of desperation, but because the method felt proven. Others avoided them entirely, associating them too strongly with confinement. Memory pulled in different directions. You realize that habits formed under pressure tend to stick longer than those formed by choice. Winter Underground applied steady pressure. It shaped responses that now surface automatically. You pause in an open field and look around. Space no longer overwhelms you, but you experience it differently. You measure distance with your eyes. You consider wind. You think about where you would shelter if needed. These thoughts feel practical rather than anxious. As days pass, some habits soften, others remain. The dugout becomes something you lived in rather than something you live in, but its logic stays close. You accept this without judgment. The season taught you something real. There is no reason to discard the lesson simply because conditions have changed. When evening comes, you still prefer softer light. You lower lamps earlier than necessary. Brightness feels unnecessary now. Calm feels better. You lie down and notice how your body arranges itself. Tucked, contained. Even in open space, you recreate the sense of enclosure that once kept you warm. The dugout no longer surrounds you, but its influence does. It has shaped how you move through rooms, how you think about shelter, how you respond to weather and time. Winter Underground was not just a place, it was a teacher, and its lessons follow you quietly into the open prairie long after the snow has retreated. Looking back does not feel dramatic. There is no sharp contrast, no clear line between then and now. Memory arranges Winter Underground as a series of textures rather than events. Weight, quiet, warmth held carefully. When you think about the dugout, you do not picture struggle so much as steadiness. You realize how rarely you describe that winter using strong language. You do not say it was heroic. You do not say it was miserable. Those words feel inaccurate. Life underground was practical. It asked for attention, patience, and respect. In return, it offered survival without spectacle. When people later asked what it was like, answers tended to be brief, warm enough, dark, quiet. These summaries sound thin, but they carry truth. The experience resists embellishment because it did not ask to be noticed while it was happening. You remember moments that seemed insignificant at the time. The way the stove sounded just before settling into a steady burn. The feel of clay under your fingers as you smoothed a crack. The weight of snow pressing evenly above your head. These details remain clearer than dates or storms. Some accounts from the period try to frame dugout life as temporary hardship on the way to something better. Other recollections treated it as a sensible solution that worked exactly as intended. Neither view captures the full picture. The dugout was not a symbol, it was a tool. You find that you resist romanticizing it now. The idea of cozy earth shelters does not quite match reality. Dampness was constant. Space was limited. Privacy barely existed. At the same time, you resist dismissing it as deprivation. The dugout provided stability when the prairie offered very little. Memory blurs the edges between endurance and adaptation. You cannot always tell where one ended and the other began. What felt like compromise then feels like competence now. You think about how little of that winter involved dramatic decision-making. Survival was achieved through routine rather than choice. You did not wake each day wondering how to live. You woke knowing what needed attention. That certainty reduced anxiety more than comfort ever could. There were moments of frustration. They do not dominate memory. They appear briefly then fade. What remains is the rhythm. Tend, adjust, rest, repeat. The dugout rewarded consistency. You recall how your expectations changed. Early on you measured comfort against outside standards. Later you measured it against function. Was the space holding here? Was the air breathable? Were supplies intact? Those questions replaced older ones about convenience or appearance. Some later writers tried to evaluate dugout life in terms of quality. Was it good or bad? That framing misses the point. The dugout was sufficient. In winter, sufficiency mattered more than quality. You notice that when you speak about it now, your tone stays even. No bitterness, no nostalgia, just acknowledgement. The dugout did what it was meant to do, you did what was required in return. You think about the prairie above during that winter. Vast, white, unyielding. The dugout did not conquer it. It stepped aside from it. That choice feels wise in retrospect. You remember the way winter changed your relationship with time. Days blurred. Weeks merged. Memory compressed. That compression remains. When you think back, the winter feels like a single season rather than many separate days. Some people remembered winters like this as defining chapters in their lives. Others treated them as something to move past quickly. Your memory sits somewhere in between. The experience mattered, but it did not demand identity. You realize that what stays with you is not the hardship, but the knowledge. Knowing how little you actually needed to remain faint. Knowing how attention could replace excess. Knowing that shelter does not have to be elaborate to be effective. You also remember the absence of performance. No one was watching, no one was impressed. Survival happened quietly. That absence of audience allowed honesty. You did what worked without needing to justify it. As time passes, the dugout recedes further into the past, but its lessons remain accessible. You draw on them during later difficulties without consciously recalling their origin. They surface as habits rather than memories. When conditions grow harsh again in other contexts, you notice yourself simplifying, reducing, paying closer attention. These responses feel familiar. They trace back to winter underground, even if you do not name it. You think about how future generations might imagine dugout life. Some will soften it. Some will exaggerate it. Both miss the subtlety. The truth lives in the middle where practicality meets patience. The dugout was not a story you told yourself. It was a space you inhabited until the season shifted. Looking back now, you respect it without longing for it. You feel a quiet gratitude not for suffering, but for learning. The winter did not test you in grand ways. It trained you in small ones. As you move forward, the dugout becomes a reference point rather than a destination. A reminder that survival does not always look impressive. Sometimes it looks like staying warm, staying observant, and staying still long enough for change to arrive on its own. That understanding settles into you gently. It does not ask to be remembered loudly. It stays ready like the earth itself, holding steady beneath whatever comes next. Quiet gratitude does not arrive all at once. It settles gradually the way snow once did, layer by layer, until you realize it has become part of how you think. You no longer feel relief at having survived the winter underground. Relief implies escape. What you feel instead is acknowledgement. You sit in a space that is no longer sealed shut by snow. Light reaches you more freely now. Air moves without effort. Yet part of you remains attuned to the steadiness that Earth once provided. You notice where warmth gathers. You notice how sound carries. You notice how much noise, light, and openness you actually need. The dugout no longer defines your days, but it quietly informs them. You find yourself trusting stability over spectacle. You value what holds rather than what impresses. That shift did not come from a single moment. It came from months of ordinary survival. People who lived this way rarely wrote about gratitude directly. Their words focused on outcomes. The roof held, the stove burned, the family remained healthy. These statements carry more appreciation than praise ever could. Gratitude did not need language. It lived in continuation. You think about how little the dugout demanded in return for what it gave. Attention, maintenance, patience, these were not heroic traits, they were accessible ones. Anyone willing to slow down could offer them. The earth did not comfort you emotionally. It supported you physically. Over time, that physical support translated into a deeper sense of trust. Trust that shelter can be simple. Trust that survival does not always require conquest. Trust that adaptation can be quiet. You remember pressing your hand against the wall in the dark, feeling solidity where sight offered nothing. That gesture returns to you now not as habit but as memory. It represents something foundational. When uncertainty grows, you learn to seek what could be felt rather than imagined. Snow taught you restraint. Earth taught you steadiness. Together they shaped a season that asked you to cooperate rather than resist. Looking back, that cooperation feels like wisdom rather than compromise. You notice how this perspective colours other parts of life. You tolerate discomfort more easily. You recognise when waiting is wiser than acting. You understand that some problems resolve themselves if given time and attention rather than force. The dugout did not offer beauty in a conventional sense. Its beauty emerged through function, through walls that held, through warmth that stayed, through silence that allowed rest. These qualities reveal themselves only when you stop expecting something else. You feel a quiet respect for the people who live this way, not because they were extraordinary, but because they adapted without drama. They accepted conditions as they were and shaped their lives accordingly. That acceptance did not weaken them. It steadied them. You also feel respect for the land itself. The prairie did not yield easily. It did not soften for comfort. But it did offer materials, earth, snow, insulation, shelter. The relationship was transactional and fair. You think about how the dugout disappeared once winter ended. Grass grew back, soil smoothed, the land reclaimed its surface. What remained was not the structure but the memory of its effectiveness. That memory does not demand retelling. It sits quietly available when needed. You carry it forward not as nostalgia but as reference. As the season turns fully and the prairie opens again, you do not rush to fill space with noise or movement. You let openness arrive gradually. You bring the calm with you. The dugout was never meant to be permanent. Neither was winter. Both served their purpose and then stepped aside. What remains is the understanding they left behind. You breathe in and feel grounded in a way that does not depend on walls or snow. Grounded because you learned what was enough. The earth taught you that survival can be quiet, that shelter does not need to announce itself, that patience is not passive, it is active attention sustained over time. You carry that lesson gently now without ceremony. The day softens as evening approaches, and you allow your body to rest into stillness without effort. There is no need to prepare for cold the way you once did. No need to listen for drips or pressure shifts. Yet the awareness remains calm and familiar. You let your breathing slow. Each breath feels complete on its own, not rushed toward the next. The rhythm is steady, unbroken. You're not waiting for anything to happen. You're simply present. Thoughts drift, but they do not demand attention. Images of earth walls, firelight, and muffled snow pass through gently, then fade. They leave no urgency behind. You feel supported not by structure, but by memory. By knowing that you have lived through stillness before and found it workable. That knowledge carries comfort into this moment. The room around you feels quiet in a way that welcomes sleep. Sounds soften, muscles loosen. The day releases its hold without resistance. You settle deeper, letting the last bits of tension drain away. Nothing needs to be decided now. Nothing needs fixing. Winter has passed. Shelter remains. Calm lingers. You rest. Sweet dream, oh, dreams.